3:15, the radio telegraph went off on the bridge. The SOS was from the Marine Electric. The crew needed help as soon as possible.
I'm approximately 30 miles from Delaware Bay entrance, going down by the bow. I seem to be taking on water forward. We need someone to come out and give us some assistance if possible.
Do you have pumps on board that can control the flooding?
Our problem is, we don't know exactly what our situation is.
When we picked up their distress signal, we were about 32 miles north-northeast of Marine Electric. We were making 18 knots, and our ETA was roughly 3 hours.
Are you in danger sinking at this time?
It's hard to say. My bow seems to be going down. We seem to be awash forward. We can't get up there. We don't have any lights to shine up there to see what's going on. We are continually taking on water forward with the bow going down.
Cutter Point Highland has been diverted and is en route to your position.
We informed the local Coast Guard station that our vessel, the tank ship Tropic Sun, would also respond to the SOS.
I think I'm gonna lose my...
On our way to render aid, we saw an unwelcome sight, one that still makes me shake my head. Vessels that must have heard the Marine Electric's SOS sailing in the opposite direction.
Older, obscure, and occasionally a bit unsettling, you're watching the Lost at Sea series on Brick Immortar. The primary sources for this video are the NTSB's Marine Accident Report, dated January 19, 1984, and the U.S. Coast Guard's Marine Board of Investigation Marine Casualty Report, dated January 11, 1985. When referencing the U.S. Coast Guard at many points in this video, it'll sometimes be used interchangeably with their Marine Board of Investigation. And it appears both the NTSB and Coast Guard considered themselves to be investigating the incident jointly, with neither overtly mentioning whether one was in a lead or support role of the other. Also, this video is so long that for the first time in my history of doing these voiceovers, I had to record over multiple days. Typically I do voiceovers for each video straight through in one sitting, but my maximum for that is roughly 1.5 to 2 hours straight before my voice fatigues too much. This video exceeds that, so I hope the session changes aren't too obvious. Anyway, as always, links to all primary and secondary sources, cross-references, and featured media will be in the description. Built in 1944 by the Sun Shipbuilding and Dry Dock Company of Chester, Pennsylvania, the Marine Electric was originally named the Musgrove Mills, a U.S. Maritime Administration design T2 tank ship, specifically type T2-SE-A1. At time of launching, the Musgrove Mills was 523 feet long, 68 feet wide, with a draft of roughly 39 feet. During World War II, 552 of these T2s were reportedly designed, built, and launched. The quote, fast tanker, fast in more ways than just nautical miles per hour. Part of the massive fleet the U.S. rushed to manufacture to combat the Axis threat. Calling the production process hurried is no exaggeration. Some were put together in about a month. From the National Park Service, quote, the average construction time of a T2 tanker was 70 days, from first laid to fleet ready, but the fastest built was 33 days. It was well understood, though, that the United States needed them desperately to succeed in World War II. From the U.S. Department of Transportation's Maritime Administration. Although the early focus of the U.S. Maritime Commission's shipbuilding efforts had been dry cargo ships, by early winter in 1941, German U-boats and commerce raiders were exacting a heavy toll on Allied tankers. These mounting losses led the agency to commission a tanker based on a standard private design already under construction at Sun Shipbuilding. The design was simple enough that shipyards could employ some of the same mass production techniques that they were using to build the Liberty dry cargo ships. These tankers, capable of 14.5 knots, were 523 feet long, with a deadweight capacity of 16,735 tons, or 141,200 barrels of oil. The vessels were turbo-electric. A steam engine drove a generator that powered a motor turning the vessel's single propeller. As with many other emergency program vessels, the Maritime Commission designed the engine this way because there was a shortage of required components for steam turbine engines, and the reciprocating engines used in Liberty ships were too slow for the tankers. Details of the Musgrove Mills' specific military service are sparse, but it was launched in May of 1944, reportedly part of a large convoy of over 25 Allied ships that left Orsay, Scotland on June 24th of that same year and arrived in New York on the 4th of July. It's difficult to find exact specifications, but like most T-2s at the time, the Musgrove Mills was likely armed for its own protection. From the National Park Service, T-2 class vessels were not designed for combat, but that did not mean they were completely unprotected. Their armament varied, but often consisted of one 5-inch, 4-inch, or 3-inch dual-purpose gun, which could target both air and surface threats. They would also have a complement of 8 20mm Oerlikon light anti-aircraft guns. Their principal safety came in numbers, and their escort vessels, which included smaller aircraft carriers, destroyers, and converted T-3 class tankers. The most common threat to the Allied vessels in the Atlantic were the German U-boats, which claimed some 3,500 merchant vessels. 8 of the merchant vessels lost to U-boats were T-2 class tankers. And in addition to Sun Shipbuilding of Chester, Pennsylvania, other shipyards that churned out the T-2 tankers were Bethlehem Steel Company of Sparrows Point, Maryland, the Kaiser Company of Portland, Oregon, which I had mistakenly mentioned as Portland, Maine, in the previous T-2 video on the Marine Sulphur Queen, Marin Ship Company of Sausalito, California, and Alabama Dry Dock of Mobile. A video of this scale takes myself and our small team of 5 literally hundreds of work hours, laboring over source materials, 3D models, drawings, schematics, location data, cross-referencing secondary sources, training and rehearsing for the final draft of my voiceover, and much more. And this is all prior to me starting the video editing phase. This channel is fully independent. We take no sponsorships on videos like these, and it's because of viewers who support our mission that we can keep doing these deep dives with such a high standard of research and production, which by extension allows me to remain the final say-so and editor-in-chief. To support these productions, get listenable podcast audio-only versions of each episode and more at patreon.com/Brick Immortar. And the Brick Immortar desktop mats are back and better than ever, finally restocked with an additional design as well as that popular 180s version, which sold out unexpectedly last December. Check it out at brickimmortar.com. Links will be in description. Or simply subscribe to this channel and help spread the message that your safety matters. World War II took a toll on the American T-2 tanker fleet, but many ships still survived, and after the armistice in May of 1945, more than 400 were designated as surplus by the U.S. government. The Merchant Ship Sales Act, passed in 1946, made it possible to sell surplus merchant ships to civilians and allies. From FreightWaves.com. It cost the U.S. government just over $3 million to construct each ship. Under the 1946 Merchant Ship Sales Act, the ships were valued at just over $2 million apiece, but that amount could be reduced to roughly $1.5 million, depending on the condition of the vessel. By 1949, 447 T-2 tankers were sold by the U.S. government to private owners, 244 going to U.S. owners, 71 under the Panamanian flag, of which most were still under U.S. control, 51 to Great Britain, and the remainder to 10 Allied countries. In May 1947, after World War II, the Musgrove Mills was one of 21 tankers that were sold to the Gulf Oil Corporation. It was renamed the Gulf Mills, and reportedly transported oil across the Atlantic for over a decade. Finally, Marine Transport Lines, or MTL, purchased the ship in 1961. Then in 1962, the Bethlehem Steel Company of East Boston, Massachusetts, converted the T2 tanker into a bulk carrier. The ship was outfitted with a new 387-foot mid-body by a manufacturer in Bremen, Germany, and renamed the Marine Electric. From the NTSB. The new mid-body section, which met U.S. Coast Guard construction standards and the American Bureau of Shipping, or ABS, 1961 rules for building and classing steel vessels, overcame T2 tank ship design problems by incorporating a riveted deck and bottom crack arresters. The main deck of the new mid-body was the same height as the forecastle deck and the afterdeck, which became part of the new main deck. The former main deck was redesignated the second deck. The converted ship was 605 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 47.25 feet deep. Importantly, the new midship section included 5 upper and lower wing ballast tanks and 5 cargo holds that were covered by steel hatches. Each hatch cover was made of roughly 1/4 inch mild steel plate panels, designed and built exclusively by MacGregor Services. MacGregor, according to their website, has been manufacturing hatch covers since the 1920s. Quote, during the 1920s, concerned over the unnecessary loss of North Sea coal ships, engineer brothers Robert and Joseph MacGregor developed the first steel hatch cover. Deceptively simple, the design consisted of 5 articulated leaves that stowed neatly at the end of each hatch. Patented in 1929, this groundbreaking concept improved ship and cargo safety and changed the face of cargo care forever. Each hatch cover on the Marine Electric had multiple panels arranged in a single pole formation, a modern iteration of the MacGregor brothers' original design. And from the NTSB, all the panels on all the hatches were equipped with traveling wheels to permit rolling of panels into place on the hatch combing. Weather tightness was achieved by lowering the wheels into recesses in the hatch combing by releasing a hydraulic jacking system and allowing the weight of the cover to rest on the gasket, setting quick-acting dogs around the periphery of the hatch, and installing cross-joint wedges between panels completed the hatch closing arrangement. In this instance, a dog is a handle that fastens down a hatch and helps make it watertight, and the combing is a raised vertical rim around an opening that helps prevent water incursion. In some cases, dogs latch onto combings to help keep a hatch door closed. The relatively thin steel hatch covers were also reinforced in many ways at the time of their manufacturing. Continued from the NTSB. Each panel was stiffened by a centerline longitudinal girder, 2 equally spaced transverse stiffeners, and transverse and longitudinal end plates. Additionally, the perimeter of the hatch cover was fitted with a gasket and steel skirt for weather tightness. During its conversion and lengthening in Germany, the Marine Electric also underwent some ballast pump alterations. Though the 3 original T2 cargo pumps were still used as ballast pumps, the aft pump room had new bilge and ballast valve manifolds installed. A single 6-inch pipe serviced each wing ballast tank, while a smaller 4-inch pipe serviced each cargo hold bilge. The port pump was used for the port wing ballast tanks, while the starboard pump was used for the starboard wing ballast tanks, but the pumps could be cross-connected. When working properly, the center pump serviced the cargo hold bilges, though whenever the ship was hauling coal, this center pump was covered so that it wouldn't get clogged with coal dust, an important detail to keep in mind. Despite many other updates, the U.S. Coast Guard allowed MTL to keep Marine Electric's sheath screw-type lifeboat davits with manila rope falls that the ship had when it was purchased in 1961. MTL did add new steel lifeboats in 64 and 66, but they never upgraded the screw-type davits to the more modern and reliable gravity davits. The screw-type davits, also referred to in the U.S. Coast Guard report as quadrantal davits. Now, a pivoted sheath screw-type davit from the Naval Ship's Technical Manual is, quote, a mechanical davit, the arms of which are generally in crescent form, which is mechanically separated in and out by means of a sheath screw. The term davit in general, meaning a crane-like device used on a ship for supporting, raising, and lowering equipment, like boats and anchors. There are many types, but in the context of life-saving equipment like lifeboats, ease of operation and deployment speed can quite literally make the difference between survival and loss of life. This kind of obsolete screw-type davit is cumbersome, slow, and must be operated by 2 crew members on the deck at either end, not on board the lifeboat itself. From the U.S. Coast Guard. The davits for the lifeboats were as originally installed on a T2 tanker. During drills, 2 men were stationed at each bit, fore and aft, and 1 man at each reel, to ensure it paid out properly. The releasing gear was a single pull lever arm that was secured by a pin amidships in the boat and released both falls simultaneously. And on a side note, in the maritime world, the opposite of pulling, reeling, or bringing a rope in is to pay it out. Bring lines in, pay lines out. More maritime terminology I find interesting. But a gravity davit differs from a screw-type davit because it is, again, from the Naval Ship's Technical Manual, a davit that requires only the force of gravity to move a boat from the inboard launching position to the waterborne position. In addition to the lifeboats, the Marine Electric also had 2 Coast Guard-approved inflatable life rafts, one made in 1977 by B.F. Goodrich, and the other made by the Switlick Parachute Company in 1980. Coal, grain, and the early 80s. The Marine Electric was often used by MTL to transport coal up and down the east coast of the United States, and occasionally to transport grain across the North Atlantic to Israel, for example. The crew, though, considered the coast-hugging coal runs to be far less dangerous. From the U.S. Coast Guard. Chief Mate Bob Cusick, in his position aboard the Marine Electric since 1978, stated he would not make a North Atlantic run with the vessel in its condition, but felt safe making coastwise trips because the Coast Guard was nearby for a rescue if necessary. The chief mate was right to be cautious about the vessel's condition, and he wasn't the only one with doubts about the aging bulker. From the book Until the Sea Shall Free Them by Robert Frump, quote, a 1976 survey of merchant mariners showed that 99% said they had sailed on a ship they considered clearly unsafe. By 1983, the converted World War II tankers were nearly 40 years old, and ever since they'd first been put to work in the private sector, several of them made the news for having literally fallen apart. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer, the first warning that all was not right with the T2s came in January 16, 1943. At 3 p.m., the Warshipping Administration accepted a T2 called the Schenectady after she completed her sea trials. At 10:30 that night, without explanation, while tied up at the dock, in calm water and weather, the Schenectady simply broke in half. 4 months later, while leaving New York Harbor, another T2, the SO Manhattan, also split in 2. Those 2 sinkings marked the beginnings of a long period of analysis of the T2s and unsuccessful efforts to correct their problems. For example, in January of '52, the tanker Pennsylvania sank with a 14-foot crack in its hull, killing 40. February 18, 1952, was a particularly bad day for T2s, when 2 of them sank. Tanker Pendleton split in 2, killing 9 men, while T2 Fort Mercer cracked in 2, killing 5. In fact, the unfortunate Fort Mercer actually broke in half twice. When the Fort Mercer was salvaged from its first accident in '52, it was repaired by welding a new bow to its old stern and renamed San Jacinto. This newly reconstituted vessel subsequently cracked again in 2 pieces and exploded off the coast of Virginia in 1964, due in part to the chemicals it carried on board. The Pine Ridge, another T2 tanker, also broke into 2 pieces, killing 7 men in December of 1960, marking nearly 2 decades of former World War II tankers dramatically cracking in half. Many in the industry theorized that the T2s and Liberty ships were particularly vulnerable to fracturing because they'd been welded together in a hurry instead of riveted. In their 1952 analysis of the Fort Mercer sinking, the U.S. Coast Guard acknowledged this possibility, stating, in connection with structural failures, the susceptibility of welded ships to extensive fractures has been known and a serious problem since early in World War II, when our shipyards turned to welding as the only means of rapidly building enough ships to support the war effort. In that same report, the Coast Guard recommended that ships welded during the war should be fitted with crack arresters to help prevent them from splitting down the middle. From the U.S. Coast Guard, T2 tankers will be required to be fitted with the equivalent of 4 additional crack arresters, and the bilge keel attachment to the shell will be changed to a riveted connection. In addition, an increase in the longitudinal strength of the ship will be required, together with a manual of satisfactory loading and ballasting, both of which will bring about a reduction in the stress level in the main hull girder. The Marine Electric itself, when it was converted from tanker to bulk carrier, had a riveted deck and bottom crack arresters installed in an attempt to overcome these inherent T2 tank ship design problems. Crack arresters had their uses, but there were deeper, more intrinsic flaws in the original T2s, flaws baked into the actual steel, a compromise that came from fabricating these World War II vessels in such a hurry. From themarinersmuseum.org. Steel is mostly iron, of course, to which you can add carbon to make it really hard. Iron is quite ductile, it bends. Its crystals just slip nicely past each other under stress. You add carbon and it hardens the crystalline structure, gives it tensile strength. Too much carbon and you end up with pig iron or even cast iron. So you add just some carbon to make steel. Then you modify it with a host of other elements to give it characteristics that you want. There are, as always, trade-offs. Sulfur, for example, and not to be confused with sulfur as a cargo, rather, sulfur as an additive in the steel fabrication process. Sulfur tends to make steel ship hull plates really brittle and prone to fracture. It also makes the steel hard to weld, but it makes for a steel that is better for machining. Add some more manganese to your steel and the sulfur problem goes away. Phosphorus will cause hardened steel to get more brittle, quite undesirable. But in low alloy, high-strength steel, it improves both strength and corrosion resistance. Sulfur and phosphorus are impurities that were present in too great a measure in the steels of ships that split in two. It was hard to weld them, and the welding materials and processes weren't nearly what they are these days. Welding those plates also created transition zones in the plates, areas that the welding heat deformed. That deformation made them less elastic and more brittle. The welds themselves broke because the metal next to them failed. That metal got hot and changed from elastic to plastic. Add to these material problems a notch or a little cut or a small crack in the steel from, say, a repair or a grounding, or even a square-cornered hatch, and a ship is in trouble. Then make it a really cold day in cold water. Add the flexing, twisting, hogging, or sagging of steaming into the teeth of a gale, or just loading and offloading cargo over the years. Now you are headed for disaster. With age, wastage, welding, and steel composition all stacked against the T2 fleet's long-term endurance, the U.S. Coast Guard's recommendation to add crack arresters was simply not enough to save them all. For example, the Marine Sulphur Queen, another T2 that we've already discussed on this channel, sank without a trace in 1963, killing all 39 crew on board. I'll leave a link to our video about the Marine Sulphur Queen in description. As investigative reporter Robert Frump wrote about that incident, quote, "No definite reason for the sinking was ever determined, and the ship was never found. But the officers investigating the loss of the Marine Sulphur Queen were faced not with 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 T2 failures. Their report in '64 stated, "The board has extensively considered the possibility that the casualty to this vessel was caused by a complete longitudinal failure of the vessel's hull girder, causing it to break in two. Insofar as this type of vessel is concerned, the evidence indicates that there have been 10 known cases of complete fractures of T2 type tank vessels." After the Marine Sulphur Queen's tragedy, the U.S. Coast Guard Marine Board issued another clear and simple recommendation that demanded there should be no more modifications to lengthen T2 tankers. From the Coast Guard's Marine Board, in the future, the same conversion of another T2 type tanker should not be approved. Further, it is recommended that no other conversion of this type of vessel should be approved which deviates from the originally designed features for the carriage of normal petroleum products. That recommendation was almost immediately overruled by the Commandant of the Coast Guard at the time, Admiral Edwin J. Rowland. According to the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Commandant wrote, "Future conversions of T2s should be considered on a ship-by-ship basis, not on the design characteristics of the class." In fact, only one of the Marine Board's recommendations about T2s was actually widely adopted. Quote, "In view of the complete structural failures of several T2 vessels, and in view of the fact that such type failure may have contributed to the instant casualty, it's recommended that all T2s be equipped with 2 inflatable life rafts, one to be located in the vicinity of the forward deck house, and the other to be located in the vicinity of the after house." In other words, T2s cracked in half so frequently that the U.S. Coast Guard suggested there should be life rafts located near the bow and stern of each vessel. This way, if the ship split in two, the crew was less likely to be trapped on a severed piece of the ship without a life raft attached to it. My friend and your friend, Mike Brady, over at Oceanliner Designs, has a wonderful deep dive into this very topic.
The bow section was rapidly carried away by the storm, along with the Pendleton's captain, John J. Fitzgerald, 7 other crew members, and the ship's radio room, leaving the remaining 33 crew members on the stern section with no way to send a distress call. They were completely alone.
If you'd like to know more about the saga of the ships that suddenly broke in two, I'll have it linked in description and pinned comment. Despite the significance of these issues, the decay of aging T2s wasn't the only thing for the Marine Electric's crew to worry about. Marine Transport Lines, or MTL, owner and operator of the Marine Electric, didn't have a great track record. MTL had also owned the Marine Sulphur Queen. As an article in the Philadelphia Inquirer points out, MTL also has a long record of maritime disasters and near misses on old ships, unequaled among American ship companies in the last 20 years. In 1963, 39 mariners were killed when the MTL's Marine Sulphur Queen, a converted World War II tanker, sank in the Gulf of Mexico. It was the worst maritime disaster in the last 2 decades. In 1961, the Marine Merchant, an MTL freighter, sank in the North Atlantic off Portsmouth, New Hampshire. The converted World War II freighter suffered a massive structural failure of the hull. In 1977, motorists narrowly escaped injury as they scurried on foot to escape when the Marine Floridian, an out-of-control MTL chemical tanker ship, rammed a bridge spanning the James River at Hopewell, Virginia. A Coast Guard investigation ruled that the ship had been unseaworthy. Despite MTL's culpability, perhaps none of these maritime casualties would have occurred if it had not been for the Jones Act. From Cornell Law, the Jones Act, also known as the Merchant Marine Act of 1920, is a federal statute establishing support for the development and maintenance of a merchant marine in order to support commercial activity and serve as a naval auxiliary in times of war or national emergency. The statute, among other things, requires shipping between U.S. ports to be conducted by U.S. flag ships. Originally, the Jones Act was supposed to protect U.S. mariners and shipbuilders. Lawmakers and unions thought they were securing American jobs in many industries by ensuring that the ships which sailed from U.S. port to U.S. port were built, owned, and crewed by Americans. They also thought that building ships under U.S. laws and regulations would force those ships to be of the highest quality, and therefore safer for those who crewed them. Additionally, they assumed that by creating a reliable merchant fleet, they would have more ships that could be commandeered during wartime emergencies. From the U.S. Department of Transportation Maritime Administration, the most far-reaching of the coastwise trade statutes is the Jones Act, a section of the 1920 Merchant Marine Act that, strictly speaking, only applies to merchandise being transported by water between U.S. points. The law requires that this cargo is to be shipped solely aboard vessels that are U.S.-built, U.S. citizen-owned, and registered in the U.S., which means crewed by Americans. This encourages a strong U.S. merchant marine for both economic security and national defense by fostering a U.S. flag fleet that can contribute to our financial well-being and act as a sea lift resource for the transportation of supplies in time of contingency. Like many well-intentioned actions, the Jones Act had unforeseen consequences. Because of the high quality demanded by U.S. regulations and the comparatively high wages that American unions had secured for shipbuilding laborers, the owners and operators of cargo shipping businesses could not afford to build multiple new vessels. Therefore, many of them continued to purchase and repurchase increasingly older U.S.-built ships, like the T2 tankers and Victory ships that had been manufactured during World War II. just to comply with the Jones Act without eating into their profits. February 1980, the hatch cover saga. Dry docked at the Jacksonville shipyards in Jacksonville, Florida, the Marine Electric was in for routine repairs and surveying by the American Bureau of Shipping, or ABS. The ABS serves as a self-proclaimed independent body that surveys and evaluates ships to ensure seaworthiness and that they comply with the U.S. Coast Guard's requirements. The ABS continues similar work to this day. From the ABS website, quote, "Founded in 1862, ABS is a global leader in providing classification services for marine and offshore assets. Our mission is to serve the public interest, as well as the needs of our members and clients, by promoting the security of life and property and preserving the natural environment. ABS' commitment to safety, reliability, and efficiency is ever present." While the Marine Electric was in Jacksonville, the ABS conducted a dry docking survey, as well as surveys of the intermediate hull, the port and starboard boiler, and the tail shaft. They also began the number 8 special survey of machinery. From the NTSB. The ABS witnessed hull gaugings which were later credited toward the number 8 special survey of the hull. An MTL structural engineer took additional hull gaugings, and U.S. Coast Guard inspectors conducted a dry dock inspection. Gaugings were not taken off the hatch covers, although it's safe to surmise that the hatch covers contained significant wastage, because during this 1980 dry docking period, the ship's operator, MTL, had a total of 98 doubler plates installed amongst the 5 cargo hold hatch covers. Also a bit of a saga in itself, which we will cover here in a bit. But doubler plates are pieces of metal welded to a larger area of plating that needs strengthening or repair, often due to holes or wastage, like a temporary patch to cover a hole in sheet metal. And wastage is the percentage of metal that has worn down over time due to rusting, corrosion, fatigue, pitting, or physical damage. Another way to put it is that all metal wears down over time, especially when it's exposed to the elements. And this often results in the metal thinning, weakening, or becoming completely perforated. And according to the U.S. Coast Guard, the only practical way of determining the degree of metal deterioration is to measure the thickness of the member in question and compare it with its original thickness. This comparison is usually expressed in terms of percentage of wastage from the original design. While the 1980 dry docking repairs continued, the hatch combings on all the hatches were renewed, and 60 hatch bolt clips were updated as well. The ABS then inspected and cleared the hatch covers, which was perhaps premature. From the NTSB. Although the new doubler plates on the hatch covers were hose tested with water at 30 psi in the presence of the ABS surveyor, the weather tightness hose test required for an ABS special survey, which requires a hose test of the entire hatch cover, was not conducted. The 1980 repairs at the Marine Electric also were not finalized in February. In May of that same year, a U.S. Coast Guard inspector in Houston, Texas, tested the upper wing ballast tanks. In June, the ABS sent a letter to MTL describing which parts of the hull plating needed to be renewed, according to their gauging reports. And in November, MTL structural engineers suggested the specifications for the work that needed to be performed on the Marine Electric. From the NTSB. The specifications included the steel renewals required by the ABS, and additional structural renewals included extensive plate renewals to the transverse bulkheads in the midship cargo area, and 20 4x2 foot, as well as 10 6x3 foot, and 3 41 foot by 2 foot doubler plates for the hatch covers, all at a 1/4 inch thickness. In preparation for these repairs, the ABS created a computer printout of its recommendations for the Marine Electric. Continued from the NTSB. Included in the printout was the erroneous notation that the hatch covers had been hose tested in February 1980. The Marine Electric went back to the Jacksonville shipyard in December of 1980 and stayed there for nearly 2 months. During this time period, MTL completed the structural renewals required by the ABS, as well as some of their own. While the vessel was dry docked, according to the NTSB, an ABS surveyor completed a dry docking survey, an annual classification survey, an annual load line inspection, a number 8 special survey of the hull, a number 8 special survey of the machinery, and a cargo ship safety construction survey. Quote, in addition to the gaugings taken in 1980, the ABS surveyor required gaugings of the main deck, the transverse bulkheads, the double bottom, tank tops, and other critical areas. However, the hatch covers were not gauged, and the ABS surveyor was not aware of the work being done to the hatch cover panels because the panels had been removed from the ship. When the hatch covers were reinstalled on the ship a few days before it left the shipyard, the ABS surveyor inspected them and found no deficiencies. He did not conduct a hose test or any other weather tightness test because the computer printout had indicated this had been done in February 1980. The U.S. Coast Guard also conducted a dry dock inspection at this time. In fact, they examined the entire structure of the vessel. However, the Coast Guard inspector did not witness any repairs to the hatch covers or conduct any tests on them of his own because they were not specifically included in a U.S. Coast Guard dry dock inspection. In fact, the hatch covers weren't even on the Marine Electric during this inspection. So, where were the hatch covers if not on the ship? Well, in two separate places. 28 of the hatch cover panels had been sent to the Bellinger shipyard in Atlantic Beach, Florida, where they received new gaskets and renewed hatch paddle stiffeners. At the same time, 7 of the panels were being repaired separately at the Jacksonville shipyard. As a part of these repairs in both shipyards, 27 more doubler plates were added to the hatch cover panels, and 2 doubler plates were installed on the dry cargo hatch on the main deck at Jacksonville shipyard. However, when the hatch covers were finally returned to the Marine Electric, they didn't actually operate properly. From the NTSB, because the hatch covers would not open or close properly after the shipyard repairs, in February of '81, MTL requested that a manufacturer's representative examine the hatch covers and recommend repairs. The representative stated that in his opinion, despite the repairs, the hatches still were not weather tight. However, he did not hose or chalk test them. He said that MTL intended to achieve weather tightness by using sealing tape. In June of '81, it was time for the Coast Guard's biennial inspection of the Marine Electric. As this took place, the Coast Guard inspector noted that the hatches were in the open position. He assumed that they were in an acceptable state because the hull inspection book, dated June 8, 1981, did not contain any comments about them. This decision may have been partially due to the inspector's lack of experience, reporting later on that he had never inspected any McGregor-type hatch covers before. Important to note, if the hatches are in the open position, this means the cargo holds are wide open, but to achieve this, the hatches themselves are, quote, stowed, and thus inaccessible, since they fold up and stack vertically, neatly behind each hold. On February 24, 1982, an ABS surveyor and the ship's chief mate Bob Cusick conducted an inspection in Baltimore and found the ship's hull and cargo areas to be in good condition. However, on March 4, 1982, another inspection at a different port revealed numerous holes in the hatch covers, which were repaired by adding 84 more doubler plates. More issues with the hatch covers were noted in May of '82, and one entire panel on the number 3 hatch cover was recommended for replacement. A repair then scheduled for November. Additional holes were found and repaired in late May and June. On June 18th of '82, the Coast Guard again inspected the ship but did not check the hatch covers, assuming that another, more thorough inspection would take place during the next load line survey, which wasn't due until February of '83. In November of '82, a representative from the McGregor Company, the hatch covers manufacturer, visited the ship to install a replacement hatch panel that his firm had fabricated for hatch number 3. He was disturbed by what he saw and wrote a thorough report about it. From his report via the NTSB. Observations. During a visit to the vessel in March of 1981, I noticed that panels on number 3 hold were in poor condition, i.e., being distorted and having wasted area on the main beams. They have deteriorated badly in the interim. At present, the coamings have holes in the wheel tracks and are so wasted that there is no strength left to support the weight of the panels without further distortion. The coaming compression bar is badly sealed and wasted, such that it should be renewed. The falling tracks are likewise weakened, wasted, and damaged. The rising tracks have slopes of uneven angles and are distorted. In addition, they are weakened so as to flex and distort easily. The panels themselves are in an even more serious state of decay. The top plates are weak, wasted, buckled, and holed in many places. The cross-joint wedges are all missing, which is a serious omission, and although the wedges are on board, the state of the panels is such that extensive welding on them could lead to further rapid deterioration. There are heavy deposits around and on the panels where hatch tape is used. The rubber gasket channels are of an incorrect size, required during past repairs, and do not fit correctly to the adjacent panels. The distortions in the panels are such that fore and aft bowing precludes the side rubber from seating on the compression bar. To compound this problem, the side skirts bend inboard and foul the compression bar, and transverse sag causes problems at the cross joints and on the coaming back. The panels on the remaining hatches appear to be in a similar condition. A judgment as to the seaworthiness and cargo protection capabilities of these panels must be examined in conjunction with the ship's classification society to fully determine their exact state, with an eye to the duration of further use, if any. The panels should be removed, grit blasted, and inspected. Those that are salvageable should be repaired. Those that are not should be renewed. The coaming should be grit blasted so that wasted and weakened areas can be identified and renewed. The panels are large, heavy, and therefore costly. To replace all 34 at one time and make the corrective repairs to the coamings would require the outlay of a large sum at one time. An alternative would be to carry out the repair one hold at a time, spreading the cost over several voyages. MacGregor Services intends to present an estimate for both of the above options in due course for your consideration. Now, the MacGregor Company wasn't the only organization with grave concerns about the condition of the Marine Electric. In December of '82, a port engineer who worked for MTL wrote a report about the deteriorating condition of the vessel and included a recommendation that MTL take MacGregor up on their offer of relatively inexpensive repairs. An excerpt from that report, according to the NTSB. The crew is presently in the process of chipping, sealing, and painting the hatch covers. In this process, the top plating of the covers becomes holed in many cases, especially along the welding of the frame beams, where new beams were welded onto existing plating. Such wasted and holed areas are being temporarily repaired with epoxy cement. The chief mate was required to make a record of all such wasted and holed areas, indicating approximate sizes and location for our evaluation, and finalizing the relevant items of the shipyard repair specifications. In reference to the above, the master stated that Mr. Graham of MacGregor indicated to him, in the course of adjusting the new hatch cover panel, that MacGregor might be able to supply a number of hatch cover panels at a low price of approximately $12,000 each, if a substantial order was placed. In view of costs already incurred in repairing the hatch covers, such offer, if upheld by MacGregor, is obviously attractive. The next panel that is now recommended to be renewed is the forward one of number 4 hatch, due to sagging." End quote. Shortly after this engineer's report, and despite his recommendations, MTL requested that the Coast Guard delay the Marine Electric's upcoming required dry docking from February of '83 to April of '83, due to a request from the vessel's charterer at the time, the New England Power Service Company, requesting the vessel remain in service, continuing to haul their coal until April 1st. Back on December 22, 1982, the Coast Guard conducted a special inspection to see if the dry docking could be delayed. They inspected parts of the ship, but not the hull or hatch covers, and approved the extension on January 6, 1983, which would have allowed the dry docking to be done between April 1st and 15th, instead of in February as originally planned. Alarmed by this decision, the Marine Electric's chief mate spent the rest of December and January creating a detailed series of sketches showing the 95 wasted areas on the hatch covers. He sent those sketches to MTL's New York office in early February in an attempt to prompt official repairs. Meanwhile, the ship's crew covered the damaged areas with epoxy to temporarily shore up the vessel's watertightness. These many problems due to aging, wastage, and inadequate repairs throughout the early 80s were already concerning. But the Marine Electric also suffered 2 incidents during this time period. First, the vessel grounded in 1981 during a routine arrival at a pier in New England from the NTSB. On July 1, 1981, the Marine Electric grounded while berthing at the New England Power Service Company pier. Divers conducted a survey in the presence of an ABS representative, a U.S. Coast Guard representative, the permanent master, and the chief engineer of the Marine Electric. Although the divers found no damage, paint had been disturbed on the bottom plating from the stem aft for about 130 feet on the port side of the hull. In addition, there was a second incident with a crane and bulldozer that carved a small hole in the Marine Electric side that the crew had to temporarily patch with cement. Again from the NTSB. On February 2, 1983, the Marine Electric sustained a 4-inch by 1-inch puncture in the side shell plating at the No. 1 upper port wing ballast tank, about 6 feet below the main deck, as a result of contact with a shoreside bulldozer being lifted aboard by a crane. A cement box was installed in the tank over the damage before the vessel sailed, and the permanent master requested that MTL repair the fracture. The repair was not made, and the fracture was not reported to the ABS or the U.S. Coast Guard as required. Only 8 days after this bulldozer incident, with the temporary cement patch still in place, the Marine Electric prepared for departure from Hampton Roads, Virginia. The crew of the Marine Electric was likely aware that their tired vessel had been manufactured 40 years prior, but during that time period, they would have also known that jobs on newer, safer ships were unfortunately rare. They did have one bright spot on the horizon, though. MTL was in the process of building a ship to replace the Marine Electric, and the crew was fully aware. The brand new vessel named Energy Independence was set to launch in only 8 more months, and many of them looked forward to transferring from the relatively ancient Marine Electric to the freshly finished Independence in less than a year, leaving the crew to hope that the modified T2 turned bulker would hang on until then. Norfolk, Virginia, February 9th, 1983. The Marine Electric often sailed a coal route between Virginia and Massachusetts. The vessel usually carried coal northbound and only ballast southbound. This trip took about 32 hours one way. Docked at Norfolk's Western Railroad Terminal along the Elizabeth River on February 9, 1983, the Marine Electric underwent an exchange of captains as the relief master, Captain Philip Corll, took control of the ship, replacing the ship's regular master. It was not his first time being in charge of the Marine Electric. He'd also held that position for about 3 months that previous summer. From the NTSB, the relief master, age 59, had held a valid U.S. Coast Guard license as master since 1978 and had served as relief master since February 1980. He first went to sea in 1943, received his third mate's license in 45, second mate's license in 47, and chief mate's license in 49. He'd been employed by Marine Transport Lines since 1976 and had served in the capacity of chief mate, or master, on tank ships of a comparable size to the Marine Electric. He'd served as relief master on the Marine Electric from June to September of '82, and again had assumed duty as relief master on February 9, 1983. Though the relief master was not the ship's usual captain, he clearly had years of experience at the helm of large vessels, including the Marine Electric itself. He also wasn't alone. Chief Mate Cusick, aside from captaining, was just as experienced as a relief master, and could even have legally captained the ship himself if he didn't enjoy his current position so much. The NTSB continues. The chief mate, also age 59, had held a valid U.S. Coast Guard license as unlimited master since 1981, although he'd never sailed as master of a ship. He received his original third mate's license in 43, his second mate's license in 44, and chief mate's license in 45. From 1952 to 62, he sailed for a company which operated coal-carrying bulk carriers. From 62 to 78, he served on various types of ships, and then in 78 he became the permanent chief mate on the Marine Electric. Although the chief mate did not stand any bridge watches, he was second in command of the vessel, and he was responsible for the loading and unloading of the cargo. He was in charge of the deck department and securing the Marine Electric for sea. He also supervised the deck maintenance of the vessel, including the hatch covers, cargo holds, and life-saving equipment. On February 10, 1983, the Marine Electric in Norfolk, Virginia, was getting ready to take on its usual load of coal. The chief mate in charge of loading had already laid the groundwork for this procedure. From the U.S. Coast Guard, the chief mate had prepared a loading sequence on a sheet of paper, which was given to the night mate and the loading master for the coal dock. The vessel was loaded in 2 passes, with the third and final pass made to trim out the ship. The sequence of loading the holds was normally 2, 4, 3, 5, then 1. But in this case, since the mate wanted to keep trim by the stern to assist in deballasting, the sequence was 4, 2, 3, 5, then 1. After the second pass, the ship was, quote, dumped down, and the only place additional coal would be stowed was in numbers 1 and 5. Before this trimming took place, the chief mate checked the drafts and, using the hydrostatic data, calculated the amount of coal that could be added to bring the ship to its summer load line, plus the fresh water allowance. The chief mate recalled that on the final trimming pass, 486 tons were added to hold number 5 and 798 tons to hold number 1. The chief mate observed the ship's drafts at the completion of loading as follows: at the bow, 34 feet 0 inches, the stern, 34 feet 8 inches, and amidships, 34 feet 4 inches, with no sag or hog and no list. Now, in the maritime world, sag is when the vessel bends downward from load distribution toward the center when looking at the vessel from the side profile. Hog is the opposite. The vessel bends upward from a load distribution that trends away from center or toward bow and stern. These can also occur as a result of stress from wave forces at sea. Loading operations were completed at about 2300 or 11 p.m. on February 10, 1983. The chief mate also went up to the bridge to check the weather report since it was cold and rainy during the ship's loading process. The report predicted gale warnings with winds of 25 to 35 knots. This did not worry the chief mate because the ship had sailed in similar conditions many times before. However, he did take extra precautions to ensure the vessel was as weather-tight as possible, particularly by dogging the hatches in as many places as they could, given the condition of the ship. From the U.S. Coast Guard, the chief mate relayed that there were about 15 dogs on each of the fore and aft edges, and about 20 on each of the port and starboard edges of each hatch cover. He said only about 50% of these dogs were usable. However, he said under ordinary conditions and in the general coal trade, it was customary to dog the corners and 1 or 2 side dogs. However, concerning the departure on February 9th of 83, he stated, "On this particular voyage, we got all of them on that we could. I had men started on them, securing them while a vessel was still at the dock loading. The hatches were closed, and as we put down the forward lines, I had 2 men going around continuously, putting all the dogs. Their instructions were, and they did, put all the dogs that would come up into the snugs." The chief mate performed his usual inspection procedures to ensure that the Marine Electric was ready for its voyage. He also confirmed that the anchors were secured by checking that the devil's claws were in place, another detail that proves crucial later. From the U.S. Coast Guard, the chief mate inspected the fore part of the vessel prior to leaving the dock. His examination revealed the access doors to the chain locker were dogged, the access plates to the bitter end of the chain were in place, the booby hatch from the stores area to the bosun's stores was secured by its 6 bolts, and the access cover to the forepeak was secured. As the ship transited the Chesapeake Bay before it reached Point Comfort, the chief mate made his report to the bridge that the ship was secured for sea, and made specific mention of the spill pipe plates and devil's claws being attached. He also confirmed that all doors and hatches in the bow section below decks were secured except the wooden hatch between the stores compartments on the second deck, and the door to the pump room, which was customarily left open and was not designed to be watertight. The weather on that February night in 1983 was blustery as the Marine Electric prepared to leave its berth. According to the Coast Guard around this time, It was raining and stormy. The wind and seas were north-northeast, with about 4-foot waves in the bay. At 2300 hours or 11 p.m., Thursday, February 10th, 1983, as the Marine Electric prepared to undock, its plotted course had them bound for Buzzards Bay, near Narragansett, Rhode Island, a distance of about 322 nautical miles from the Chesapeake Light Tower, the reference point for the beginning of their at-sea journey, according to the U.S. Coast Guard. All was normal aboard the vessel with one exception. The third assistant engineer was not present. The chief mate assumed that the storm had caused this, typically reliable engineer, to miss the scheduled departure time. And since there were many other engineers on board, the decision was made to leave without him. Though the weather was rough when they embarked, the ship and crew held their own and proceeded business as usual. The harbor pilot who'd been aboard, in the wheelhouse, guided them out of the Chesapeake area until they reached the pilot station at the mouth of the bay, at roughly 0200 or 2 a.m. The pilot then argued with himself out loud about whether or not to depart the vessel as planned. Several crew members overheard his personal debate. From Until the Seas Shall Free Them by Robert Frump. The seas were high, the pilot pickup boat was small. Would it be easier to ride the Marine Electric to Massachusetts in this storm? Or should he risk going down the fragile pilot's ladder to the wave-tossed harbor craft? The pilot boat was alongside the Marine Electric, and now it was time for a decision. Ride the ship or take the boat. "I'm getting off," the pilot said, and a few moments later, he descended the ladder, sprayed by waves. He timed his jump correctly and soon was safe on the deck of the boat below. But the pilot was not the only crew member who changed vessels during this encounter. The third assistant engineer surprised everyone by climbing up the ladder that the pilot had just descended. Though the engineer had missed getting on the ship prior to departure, he decided to hitch a ride out with the pilot boat to catch up with the Marine Electric, not wanting to lose his job. Bound for Buzzards Bay, Rhode Island, and ultimately the New England Power Service Company's coal plant in Somerset, Massachusetts, a roughly 322 nautical mile, 2 to 3 day journey up the Atlantic coast. The Marine Electric had taken on board about 2,700 barrels of fuel, bringing the fuel on board to a total of roughly 3,600 barrels, or 545 tons. Underway there were now 23,000 tons of coal amongst the 5 holds, water and fuel oil holds topped off, along with 7 officers, the ship's captain, chief mate, second mate, 2 third mates, a radio officer, and the chief engineer, 7 ABs, 2 OSs, 7 crew and engineering, plus 1 engineering cadet, a single bosun, 2 kitchen crew, and 7 deckhands and utility crew members, all under the employ of Marine Transport Lines, a total of 34 souls aboard. Early Friday morning, February 11th, 1983. From the U.S. Coast Guard. The Marine Electric, while on a northeasterly course at a speed of about 8 knots, encountered headwinds of gale force and boisterous seas, which caused the vessel to roll, pitch, and ship water over its main deck and forward hatch covers. The weather was estimated at 34 to 46 knots, with seas 10 to 15 feet from the northeast. By dawn, the wind increased to 50 knots, with seas between 20 and 40 feet from the northeast. At 0700 on February 11th, 1983, the vessel was pitching in a heavy northeasterly sea. Now, this wasn't unusual weather during winter months for vessels in the North Atlantic, and the Marine Electric had survived worse. In December of '82, just 2 months prior, the vessel had endured force 9 winds on the Beaufort scale, 41 to 47 knots from the northeast while on a similar journey. In January of that same year, the ship had experienced 25-foot seas from the northeast. In both of these incidents, the ship was fully loaded and came through, for all we know, without incident. At around 9 a.m., the captain reduced the vessel's speed to 40 RPM due to storm conditions. The crew logged the weather every 4 hours at the end of each watch. The 8 a.m. to noon third mate recorded the conditions during his watch as having wind from the northeast at 48 to 55 knots. He also described the seas as, quote, very rough, and noted that they reached heights of 25 to 30 feet, with, quote, intermittent rogue waves, also known as extreme storm waves, of 35 to 48 feet. From the Coast Guard, occasionally the third mate was at eye level with the seas. The vessel was taking green seas over the starboard bow and foredeck. The seas were breaking fairly heavy up on the forecastle deck area. The bow was rising and readily shedding the water. The seas were fine on the starboard bow and broke right at the anchor windlass in the vicinity of the doghouse. Now, in this instance, green seas, or green water, refers to the seawater that comes over the bow or gunnels and remains on deck. It's a normal occurrence to an extent, as ships must be capable of shedding green water passively via scuppers or drains. After all, a ship must always be able to handle rain, for example. All water that could accumulate on deck must be able to drain without the need of pumps. It can of course become an issue, though, if green water splashing up on deck accumulates or begins reaching areas that are not watertight. The Coast Guard continues. During the afternoon on February 11th, 1983, the wind and seas continued to build. The vessel was still taking green seas over the bow, and the bow was rising and falling without any sign of sluggishness throughout the afternoon. The metal guards covering the bowl gears on the windlass were torn off. From time to time, seas were coming over the hatches, and intermittent green seas were coming over the bow. Seas were hitting on the dry cargo hatch during the storm. The doghouse protected the starboard side, but the port side was being hit by the seas. Occasionally, green seas came over the cargo hatches. The vessel was not slamming or pounding, but intermittently she shuddered. By this point, the Marine Electric's progress had slowed to a crawl. Though they'd left Norfolk at 10 knots, by noon on Friday, they'd slowed to 8 knots, and by 1500, or 3 p.m., the crew called MTL to inform them that the ship had hove to, and was now only proceeding at 1 knot. The phrase heave to, in this instance, is a storm survival tactic in which a motorized ship comes to a relative standstill, facing into the wind. This is different than when sailboats heave to, and the past tense, not used very often in modern times, is, quote, hove to. From the American Sailing Association. For sailboats, heaving to is setting the sails so the jib wants to sail one way, while the main wants to sail another. So, with some rudder adjustment, the boat stands nearly still. In sailing, this position can be used to endure storms as safely as possible, but it can also be used to merely halt the progress of the vessel, so that the crew can rest or make repairs. For motorized vessels, a heave-to is nearly always a storm endurance method. When the Marine Electric hove to, its bow was aimed into the wind with its forward progress nearly stopped. This was most likely a strategic decision to try and reduce the storm's ill effects on the ship. To heave to is typically not a decision a captain makes lightly, since it would greatly slow the progress of the journey and potentially delay their arrival. The weather conditions, however, had become severe enough that they felt it necessary. From the NTSB. The 8 to noon third mate observed the winds were from the northeast at 48 to 55 knots. The seas were from the northeast and 25 to 35 feet high, and green seas were coming over the starboard bow. He said the seas were breaking near the anchor windlass on the forecastle, but the vessel was shedding her water properly. She was getting rid of it easily. It was riding fairly smooth. With others on board noting that from 11:50 to 1:50 p.m., there were 15-foot seas with 10-foot swells. It was around this time that another vessel got into trouble nearby and began calling for help. Continued from the NTSB. About 13:20 or 1:20 p.m., the master of the 65-foot fishing vessel Theodora called U.S. Coast Guard Station Ocean City, Maryland, and stated that they were taking on water, the vessel's pumps were inoperative, and that he was unsure of his position. The Theodora had departed from Cape May, New Jersey, the previous evening, and was headed presumably toward fishing grounds roughly 30 nautical miles east of Chincoteague, Virginia. And from the U.S. Coast Guard, when the captain radioed for assistance, the Theodora was taking on water and the crew was disoriented. But the weather was also frustrating the Coast Guard's response efforts. The NTSB continues, At 2:48 p.m., Cutter Point Highland got underway from the Coast Guard station at Chincoteague to search for the Theodora. However, at 3:20 p.m., a mechanical problem caused the Point Highland to return to the Coast Guard station. At 3:10, a U.S. Coast Guard HH-3F Pelican helicopter was launched from Elizabeth City, North Carolina, about 120 nautical miles southwest of Theodora's position, to search for the fishing vessel and deliver portable pumps to them. At 3:30, an airborne Coast Guard HC-130 Hercules fixed-wing aircraft was diverted to search the area and arrived at about 3:45. However, limited visibility prevented the aircraft from locating the Theodora at that time.
This is Coast Guard Station Ocean City. Coast Guard Station Ocean City, with an urgent marine information broadcast, requesting any vessels in the area to help locate the 65-foot fishing vessel Theodora.
Back aboard the Marine Electric, the chief mate and one of the ABs had spotted the 65-foot fishing vessel while securing the mooring lines at around 3:30. Instead of remaining in the relatively safe heave-to position, the ship's master decided they'd turn and proceed toward the stricken Theodora in hopes to render aid. At about 3:45, the bulker was underway. As if conditions weren't difficult already, snow began to fall, and visibility was reduced to about 1.5 nautical miles. Nevertheless, within about 15 minutes, the 605-foot Marine Electric spotted the 65-foot Theodora from the NTSB. At 4 p.m., the master of the Marine Electric called the U.S. Coast Guard station at Ocean City on VHF, Channel 16, and reported that he'd located the Theodora and then relayed their coordinates. U.S. Coast Guard station Chincoteague responded,
We're requesting that you stand by the Theodora until Point Highland arrives.
At 4:13, the C-130 overhead located the Theodora, and at 4:24, the Coast Guard helo made visual contact as well. At 5:29, the Coast Guard helo delivered the portable pumps to the Theodora and then returned to Elizabeth City. Before the C-130 departed the scene, the pilot reported the Marine Electric's coordinates, a position roughly 25 miles off the coast, and that both vessels were heading due west. Meanwhile, at around 5:24 p.m., the 80-foot cutter Point Highland was again dispatched from Chincoteague. The Point Highland, an 82-foot patrol boat, contained 8 to 10 crew members and was able to make up to roughly 23 knots. The Marine Electric had responded to the Coast Guard's request to stand by the Theodora until the Point Highland arrived and could take over escorting the struggling fishing vessel back to shore. But this act of kindness came with serious risks, as the Marine Electric was also getting battered by the storm while they awaited the Point Highland's relief. From the U.S. Coast Guard, at 6:18 p.m., the Point Highland estimated rendezvous at 8:30. They were making 8 knots at the time. At 6:22, the Marine Electric reported to the Coast Guard that they did not know if they would be able to hold the course. At the time, they were taking green water over their starboard side all the way across the deck. And from the NTSB, at 5:38 p.m., Marine Electric's master reported,
I'm having problems out here in this water weather.
At 5:44, he reported being on a course of 270 and making about 5 knots over the ground. At 5:49 p.m., the master reported the Marine Electric's position still at roughly 25 miles off the coast of Chincoteague, and that
We are in the midst of a very serious rain squall here. A course of 270 from my present position will put me in trouble. I cannot steer 270.
the U.S. Coast Guard responded,
Requesting you continue on course 270 until the Point Highland can rendezvous.
At 5:54 p.m., Marine Electric's captain stated,
I'll set a course for Chincoteague.
which would have been that requested course of about 270. However, at 6:22, about 30 minutes later, the captain followed up again, stating,
I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep on this course. I'm taking an awful beating out here. I'm going to be in trouble myself pretty soon.
U.S. Coast Guard Ocean City replied.
Can you maintain position until the Point Highland arrives?
Marine Electric's captain responded,
I don't know how I can hold heave 2 on this course. I'm rolling, taking water, green water over my starboard side, all the way across my deck.
By this time, the Theodora had been using the portable pumps delivered by the Coast Guard helo for almost an hour, and their situation had improved enough that the vessel's captain was comfortable waiting for the Point Highland alone. From the Coast Guard, the Theodora replied they were running pretty good and should be able to make the rendezvous with the Coast Guard. At about 6:24 p.m., the Coast Guard told the Marine Electric she was free to proceed to the original destination. The Marine Electric confirmed they were released from standing by the Theodora, then reported they were heading for Breton Reef, Newport, Rhode Island. At about 8 p.m., the Point Highland caught up with the Theodora, and the two vessels began their journey back to safer waters. Though weather conditions were extremely treacherous, and the Marine Electric was taking significant water over its bow, during this entire rescue operation, the vessel never grounded, at least according to Chief Mate Cusick. The Coast Guard continues, the Chief Mate believed the vessel turned to port after being released from the Theodora. He felt the seas had increased, but the vessel was still lively, the bow rising with the sea. There was no noticeable change in the behavior and response of the vessel when it resumed its northeasterly course. The Chief Mate looked at the charted position of his vessel while aiding the Theodora, and upon returning to its original track line, estimated the depth of water where the Marine Electric left the Theodora to be about 16 fathoms, or 96 feet. At no time did he feel the Marine Electric had grounded, a crucial detail to keep in mind. After aiding the Theodora, the Marine Electric's crew returned to their own mission, slowly working toward their destination port and surviving the storm. And for now, the bulker would once again heave to for safety, making very little headway. After roughly an hour, everything seemed back to normal. When the watch changed at 7:45, the third mate noted that all the equipment was functioning properly and that the waves, although still 20 feet high, were not impacting the vessel as heavily as they were in the morning. However, the third mate noted, quote, there was still an awful lot of seawater coming across the deck. The storm had lost some of its teeth. Earlier watches had noted force 9 winds, or up to 54 miles per hour. But by midnight on Friday, the wind had slowed to about 19 to 30 miles per hour, coming from the northwest. It's likely the crew felt they'd finally passed through the worst of it. From the NTSB. When the AB assumed the lookout watch on the starboard bridge wing, at about 11:50 p.m. Friday night, the Marine Electric was on a course of 040, or roughly north-northeast. The seas were 15 to 20 feet high, and the AB observed that the bow appeared to be just down a little bit. Between 1 and 2 a.m. on Saturday, February 12th, the AB was by then in standby status and went below to change into dry clothes. While below, the AB ran into an engineer from the U.S. Coast Guard. Between 1 and 1:50 a.m., the 12 to 4 a.m. AB was below in the mess hall. One of the ship's engineers asked him, "Are we down by the head?" He responded that he thought so, or meaning down by the bow. When the AB got back to the bridge at 2 a.m. to relieve the helmsman, he noticed that the captain and 12 to 4 third mate were on the bridge, discussing the bow's slow recovery rate. As the third mate and captain looked on, the Marine Electric struggle appeared to worsen. Continued from the Coast Guard. At or about 2:10 a.m., the 12 to 4 AB estimated that green water was washing back on the main deck as far as the number 2 hatch. After observing the impact of the green water on the bow of the Marine Electric, the captain must have found reason for concern because he soon went to wake the chief mate. From the NTSB. About 2:30 a.m., the master went to the chief mate's room, woke him, and said, "Come up on the bridge. I believe that we're in trouble. I think she's settling by the head." The chief mate went to the bridge, looked at the bow, ran down below, got the chief engineer, and returned to the bridge. The chief mate stated, quote, "I took one quick look and it was apparent that she was down by the bow. The seas were staying there. The bow was not lifting up properly." Though the storm had abated somewhat and the direction of the wind had changed to the northwest, the ambient temperatures had unfortunately dropped to about 28 degrees Fahrenheit, or -2 degrees Celsius, which is the approximate freezing point for salt water. The surface water temperatures in this part of the Atlantic during the time of year in question were around 39 degrees Fahrenheit, or plus 4 degrees Celsius on average. And keep in mind, the Marine Electric's life-saving equipment did not include immersion suits for the crew. Below freezing temperatures also required maintenance to enact several procedures for the continued operation of the vessel. They turned on deck steam to the anchor windlass, mooring, and hatch panel winches. This would ensure these crucial pieces of equipment didn't completely ice over. For example, a frozen anchor windlass would make it extremely difficult to raise or lower the anchor. The crew also tried to call the engine room to tell them about the temperature drop, but discovered their shipboard phone wasn't working. Yet another detail to keep in mind. From the U.S. Coast Guard. Because the phone wasn't working, the ordinary seaman, or OS, was sent down to relay the message. Later, handheld radios were used to communicate between the bridge and the engine room. As the crew attempted icing prevention, the captain, although still unsure what was causing the issues exactly, decided that their situation was serious enough to call for help. And from the NTSB, at 2:51 a.m., the master called Coast Guard Station Ocean City on VHF, Channel 16, and reported,
I'm approximately 30 miles from Delaware Bay entrance and I'm going down by the head. I seem to be taking on water forward. I'm a coal carrier, 5-hatch coal carrier. I'm loaded with 23,000 tons of coal. We are positively in bad shape. Positively in bad shape. We need someone to come out and give us some assistance if possible. Our problem is, we don't know exactly what our situation is.
It was around this same time that the radio officer in the radio room began broadcasting that SOS that there is recordings of. Since the wind direction shifted with the relatively abrupt change in weather, the Marine Electric's heave-to position was also no longer protecting it from the 20-foot waves. From the U.S. Coast Guard, the seas were, quote, roaring down the deck. No suggestion or attempt was made to bring the ship about. At this time, the captain ordered the chief mate to call all hands and to stand by the boats. The general alarm was not sounded. Only 3 minutes after his first call, the captain called the Coast Guard several times in quick succession. At 2:54 a.m.,
I'm having my crew muster at the lifeboats.
1 minute later at 2:55,
I'm steering 030.
and the captain relayed their position of approximately 30 miles from the nearest coastline, 60 miles from the Delaware Bay entrance. At 2:57 a.m.,
I'm altering my course to due north to try to head for Delaware Bay entrance.
from the NTSB, after the master described the Marine Electric and its speed, 1.5 knots, Coast Guard Ocean City responded.
Are you in danger of sinking at this time?
At 3:08 a.m., the master replied,
It's hard to say. My bow seems to be going down. We seem to be awash forward. We can't get up there. We don't have any lights to shine up to see what's going on. I'm not listing. I seem to be going down by the head fast.
While the captain made these crucial calls, the chief mate tried to get all hands to their lifeboat positions. From the U.S. Coast Guard, the chief mate dispatched the 12-4 OS to call the men. He woke the bosun and the dayman himself, told them to dress in heavy clothes, to come up and ready the boats, or lifeboats. They removed the covers from the boats and released the forward gripes, leaving the after gripes on. They then removed the stanchions from around the life rafts, but did not release the strip to the hydrostatic release gear. They also gathered life rings and stacked them on the boat deck. The general belief was that nothing serious was going to happen. The lifeboat covers were folded and stowed in anticipation of soon recovering the boats. Now, with the captain and crew reportedly acting as though most of their prep work was only precautionary, no urgency was reported at this time. The crew didn't even follow their emergency protocols because no emergency was officially declared, and still no general alarm had been sounded. From the NTSB, at about 3 a.m., the 8 to 12 third mate was awakened by another crew member. The 8 to 12 third mate had immediately sensed that the ship was trimmed forward. He donned his life jacket and reported to the bridge, where he saw, quote, seas covering the forward part of the ship and breaking all the way back to the number 3 hatch, the aft end of number 2, the forward part of number 3. He stated no emergency alarms were sounded, so he did not relieve the watch as required by the station bill in an emergency. As the bow dipped further, without properly recovering, the captain and chief engineer both tried to literally shed light on the problem in an attempt to figure out what was going on. There was no spotlight on the ship, so the engineer aimed a tankerman's portable light on the bow. He suspected that the lid of one of the hatches had been crushed inward, but without a spotlight to shine through the darkness, he couldn't see clearly enough to be sure. The captain also appeared to have similar suspicions, requesting the Coast Guard for assistance with this specifically. From the U.S. Coast Guard quote, at 3:15 a.m., the Marine Electric requested the Coast Guard provide a helicopter with a spotlight to illuminate the forward part of the vessel.
We are in the process of doing that right now. Cutter Point Highland has been diverted and is en route to your position.
At 3:17 a.m., the Marine Electric notified the Coast Guard on Channel 16.
What we think happened is the number 1 hatch is broke.
They also stated they were pumping with good head pressure. At 3:22 a.m., the captain told the Coast Guard that they still had not officially determined the cause of flooding, but that the forward decks were awash, and then relayed their updated position coordinates, which placed them approximately 30 miles east-southeast off the coast of Chincoteague. And keep in mind, for the forward decks to be awash or seas to be all the way back to the number 3 hatch requires quite the trim down by the bow into the water. Overhearing these coordinates, distress calls, and that constantly blaring SOS, vessels within range began responding with offers to help. From the U.S. Coast Guard. At 3:27 a.m., the tanker Tropic Sun called to say they had picked up the distress messages, relayed their coordinates, and was about 8 miles southeast of the Delaware Sea buoy. They estimated they were about 32 miles north-northeast of the Marine Electric, and mentioned a Norwegian vessel, the Briganger, was closer, and trying to contact the Marine Electric on the wireless. While their bow dipped lower and lower, Marine Electric's crew began to prepare for an emergency by putting on life jackets, prepping the emergency position indicating radio beacon, or EPIRB, and getting the lifeboats and life rafts ready to launch. Still, though, no official all-hands alarm was sounded, even though the situation had clearly become more urgent. From the NTSB. The 8 to 12 third mate said that everyone but the master had donned his life jacket and that he overheard someone say they were pumping out numbers 1 and 2 starboard tanks. He also said the chief engineer believed that, quote, the number 1 hatch had stove in, or caved in, but that he could not tell because he said water was covering the number 1 hatch cover. At that time, the 8 to 12 third mate saw 6 or 7 feet of water on the deck, and the ship had a 5 to 8 degree trim down by the bow. The 8 to 12 third mate helped to ready the starboard lifeboat, gathered and placed life rings on the afterdeck, and cut the EPIRB free, standing it upright in its box on the port bridge wing. Now, the EPIRB, or Emergency Position Indicating Radio Beacon, is a device that alerts search and rescue organizations to a vessel's location in an emergency. EPIRBs can either be activated automatically when a ship sinks or manually, as the third mate did in this instance. The EPIRB is then intended to float and transmit pertinent data automatically, like current coordinates and pre-programmed vessel info via satellite. At around 3:50 a.m., the situation started deteriorating rapidly. From the U.S. Coast Guard. At 3:51 a.m., the Marine Electric radioed they were now listing a little bit. At 3:52 a.m., the ship reported that her forward deck that leads into the forecastle was underwater, and that she was taking a starboard list. When informed that the Point Highland would be on scene around 6:15, the Marine Electric replied they didn't think they could hold on that long. And from the NTSB. At 3:55 a.m., the master reported to the U.S. Coast Guard that the ship was listing about 5 degrees and was rolling to 14 degrees. About 4 a.m., the chief mate went to the bridge, observed a 5-degree list on the ship's inclinometer, and then went below to the boat deck to stand by the starboard lifeboat. From the U.S. Coast Guard. The captain ordered the chief mate to swing out the boats. The ship had about 5-degree starboard list at this time, and only the starboard boat could be swung out. The chief mate stayed by the boat. At about 4:04 a.m., the Marine Electric reported an 8-degree starboard list. At 4:08, the master radioed,
I think I'm going to lose my ship here. We're starting to take a real bad list to starboard.
At about 4:10 a.m., the radio operator came on the bridge and said he had messages from 2 merchant vessels. One was due on scene at about 0800 or 8 a.m., roughly 4 hours out. End quote. On the bridge, everybody kind of let out a sigh of despair, since they knew the ship would not stay afloat that long. The ship listed even further to starboard, and the captain told the helmsman to leave his station, since the ship was not answering the rudder too well by that time.
Vessel Marine Electric, this is Coast Guard Station Chincoteague. Rescue helicopters are en route to your position. ETA roughly 30 minutes.
Although this was welcome news, it was clear there was no saving the vessel at this point. The captain ordered everyone to abandon ship. The Coast Guard continues. The general alarm was never sounded. The third mate did give a quick blast on the whistle for abandon ship just before leaving the bridge. The orders to stop or secure the engines were passed verbally over the handheld radios. And for reference, according to the Coast Guard, the abandoned ship signal via the ship's whistle or horn being 7 short blasts followed by 1 long. So unmistakable and very loud, but still doesn't take the place of a general alarm. The usual way to communicate with the engineers, those shipboard phone lines, they'd malfunctioned earlier in the evening. This communication difficulty was potentially life-threatening. From the NTSB. It was also around this same time, about 4:10 a.m. The master instructed the crew to abandon ship and instructed the AB to proceed to the starboard lifeboat. The chief mate got the lifeboats and life rafts ready for launching, and when he heard the ship's whistle blow a signal meaning abandon ship, he ordered the crew to launch the lifeboat. At 4:14 a.m., the master reported to the U.S. Coast Guard.
We're abandoning ship right now. We're abandoning ship right now.
The 8 to 12 third mate was on the bridge when the captain called for them all to abandon ship, and he tried making his way to the lifeboats, but the vessel's severe list at that point made it extremely difficult. From the NTSB, the 8 to 12 third mate stated, the master went out the starboard bridge wing and down that way. I went down the inside passage, which takes you by the radio shack, and then onto the outside decks. As I started down the ladder in the inside, I thought it would be a little bit quicker, and I jumped. I would try to catch the second step and try to jump halfway down, but I missed the steps and fell all the way to the bottom of the ladder. Just before I was at the top of the ladder, I don't know where I got the walkie-talkie in my hand. I think it was laying on the chart table, but I heard the first engineer call from the engine room. He wanted to know if they wanted the fuel oil pumps secured. I believe that is what he asked. The fuel oil pumps, and I just responded, Mike, get the hell out of there, we're going down. The earlier attempts to communicate with the engine room failed, due to the shipboard phone system malfunction, and now the handheld radios were not working as expected either. The engineers had clearly missed the signal to abandon ship, and this cost them precious minutes. The general alarm would be what sounds throughout the ship's interior, so those that are in engineering can also hear warnings that the ship is going down and crew are expected to abandon. After his attempt to warn the engineers one last time, the third mate paused during his escape to throw some life rings into the sea, hoping that they would potentially save some of his fellow crewmen, but again, the list to starboard made this very difficult. From the U.S. Coast Guard, I came to the spot where we'd piled all the life rings. I stopped there and started throwing life rings over the side of the ship. I believe it was probably half a dozen life rings sitting there, and I think maybe 3 or 4 of them made it into the water. The rest hit the overhead and bounced directly back down onto the deck. At this time, the AB was also attempting to reach the lifeboats. The antiquated screw-type davit lifeboats required crew members outside the boat to facilitate a launch, instead of just using gravity. This again cost the crew precious time. Continued from the U.S. Coast Guard. When the AB reached the ladder above the deck, he said that the men had just finished cranking the starboard boat in some, since the vessel was listing to such a degree. 3 or 4 people were hanging onto the ladder as he worked his way down to assist in launching the boat. And from the NTSB. When the AB reached the lifeboat, it was still hanging from the davits and the crew was trying to pull the boat closer to the rail. The AB tried to help bring the boat in, but at 4:15 a.m., the Marine Electric capsized to starboard, throwing the AB and others into the water. The Marine Electric had gone from what appeared to be briefly holding a heavy starboard list to suddenly capsizing within a matter of seconds. Chief Mate Cusick recounted, "And without any warning, at this point, I was standing there. I wasn't holding on to anything, and the lifeboat was slacking away on these davits. And at this point, the ship just rolled from a list right completely down on her side. And the next thing I knew, it was like the sound of the water going out of a bathtub, amplified a billion times, and I was clawing and swimming up, and I had been standing where I was outside the 12 to 4 engineer's room, and the lights were still on. I looked right in the porthole and swam by it. I kept swimming till I reached the railing. I turned it and I shot up. The third mate later told the NTSB, "All of a sudden the ship just rolled, and I saw the water level start to rise, and before the gear was even released on the lifeboat, the seas picked it up, brought it right in front of me up against the stack, and I just watched the ocean level come up and grab me. As I went into the water, I looked up and I saw the master on his deck, climbing over the railing, trying to get into the water." The crew had been ordered to the lifeboats at 4:10 a.m., and 5 minutes later, the ship began capsizing. Because the screw-type davits had not been updated to the faster-launching gravity davits, no lifeboats were properly launched before the ship went under. Instead, every soul above decks, outside, went into the near-freezing water. Again, ambient temperatures were roughly 28 degrees Fahrenheit, and water surface temperatures 39 degrees Fahrenheit. From the U.S. Coast Guard. The lifeboat had been only about 5 feet from the water when the ship took the roll. Now it was floating, but still attached to the falls. The AB was between the ship and the boat when he felt himself being pushed underwater by some steel. He finally was able to break free and reach the surface again. He saw the ship still slanted at about 60 degrees and swam on his back away from it. Within 5 to 15 minutes of the capsizing, he reached back, felt a line, turned, and saw it was attached to a life raft still contained in its canister. Propping his feet against the canister and pulling on the line, he caused the raft to inflate. However, finding and inflating a life raft didn't mean that the danger was over for the AB. His battle to get up and inside of it was painstaking and time-consuming. Continued from the Coast Guard. He tried for 15 to 20 minutes before he was able to enter the raft. 3 other men swam to the raft as he was trying to get in. He tried to help one man into the raft but had no success. The AB said they just clung to the raft and did not try much to get inside. They may have been in shock. The second mate also came to the raft. The second mate told the AB to get the ladder. The AB looked through the raft, then saw there was a cargo netting type ladder on the side of the raft opposite from where the other 4 men were. He directed the men to the other side of the raft and stated he had to repeat himself many times to be understood by those in the water. Even with the assistance of the ladder, and after half an hour of trying, the AB could not get anyone into the raft. The netting was flush against the raft, and the mate couldn't get his hand around it. The icy water had made it very difficult for the AB to climb into the life raft himself, and totally impossible for others to grasp the ladder and pull themselves up. Water this frigid saps a person's strength quickly, and hand strength is no exception. While an immersion suit can make manipulation with thick gloves, along with maneuvering in general, difficult, This pales in comparison to having no barrier between your body and frigid, turbulent waters, like the crew that night. As Dr. C.J. Brooks wrote in his 2001 paper titled Survival in Cold Water, the ability to do such tasks as climb into a life raft, cling to a line, or activate a flare depends on manual dexterity and grip strength. The ability of muscle to produce force is reduced when its temperature falls below 27 degrees Celsius or 81 degrees Fahrenheit. The maximum voluntary grip strength of subjects who immerse their unprotected hands or forearms in 5 degrees Celsius or 41 degrees Fahrenheit water was reduced by 16%. Research has also shown that hand grip strength was reduced by up to 60%, manual dexterity reduced by 30%, and speed of finger flexing was decreased by 15 to 25%. In fact, according to the NTSB, with a water temperature of 39 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 4 degrees Celsius, the crew that was now in the water could only expect 15 to 30 minutes before they would fall unconscious, and roughly 90 minutes before hypothermia would become fatal. When the Marine Electric capsized, the third mate was also thrown into the water. In the freezing cold, he rolled onto his back and assessed the situation. He knew he was in the water, and that being adrift in the cold Atlantic Ocean, without even a life raft, was, in his words, a tight situation. In the darkness and the storm, he could only see the shadow of the ship's hull, but he could tell it was on its beam end and listing 90 degrees to starboard. After about half an hour, the third mate found 2 life rings floating with 5 men holding onto them. He joined the group and clung on, and they periodically sounded off, calling out their own names to prove that they were still alive. The chief mate was also struggling to survive. When the Marine Electric capsized, he swam away from the ship until he fortunately happened upon one of the lifeboats. This boat had holes and was flooded all the way up to the seats, but because of its buoyancy tanks, it was staying afloat. From the chief mate via the NTSB. It was freezing cold up in the air. The sea came over and tried to wash me off. I had a good grip of the brace that holds the part to the side of the lifeboats, so I got back down underneath the water and stayed under there till daylight came. I kept kicking and thrashing around to keep the circulation. All the time I kept looking out and yelling out, "Lifeboat here, come here! Lifeboat here!" Just continued yelling out to keep myself going, and maybe someone was there that could come over, and I could have helped them. I could have dragged them in very easily, because the boat was only a few inches out of the water." Unquote. But no other survivors appeared. The Marine Electric had been in communication with the Eastern Shore Coast Guard since 2:51 a.m., when the relief master first confirmed that they were going down by the head. The Coast Guard was already mounting a rescue effort via Station Ocean City, Maryland, and the 5th Coast Guard District Operations Center located in Portsmouth, Virginia. At 3:10 a.m., the first ship told to go to the Marine Electric's aid was Cutter Point Highland, the very same Coast Guard vessel that had been escorting fishing vessel Theodora back to safety. The cutter was about 35 nautical miles west of the casualty when they received orders, immediately turned around, and began speeding back to where they came from. At 3:18 a.m., Coast Guard Station Elizabeth City, North Carolina, was commanded to launch its ready helicopter, the HH-3F Pelican, Unit Number 1471. As a side note, the Sikorsky HH-3F was notably, what would nowadays be quite rare, one of several amphibious helicopter types the U.S. military employed in the time period. Unfortunately, the helicopter wouldn't actually get into the air until 4:13 a.m., nearly an hour later, in part because they struggled to get a firm location of the Marine Electric. Despite the third mate deliberately setting off the EPIRB, the device had suffered some kind of malfunction and was not broadcasting the vessel's coordinates. The helo was also delayed because, when they'd first mustered, they were told the Marine Electric was taking on water, so they loaded portable pumps accordingly, which was the same method that had saved the Theodora. However, before they could lift off, word came through that the crew of the Marine Electric had abandoned ship, so they had to offload the pumps and make room for survivors. A crucial detail to keep in mind. Because they had recently endured intense storm conditions in the same area when aiding the Theodora, Elizabeth City's helicopter crew also requested assistance from a fixed-wing C-130 Hercules, unit number CG-1347. The C-130 would take off at 5:09 a.m. The Coast Guard also mustered a second helicopter, another HH-3F Pelican, unit number 1434, which was airborne by 5:13 a.m. A Navy SH-3G Sea King helicopter, unit number 737, was also dispatched from Naval Air Station Oceana, Virginia, at the request of the District Operations Center. Incredibly, because it was a Saturday, there were no Navy search and rescue teams on duty, and they had to put out a call for volunteers. From militarynews.com, the Coast Guard called the Naval Air Station Oceana Air Operations Duty Office at 4 a.m., requesting assistance to aid in the search. An air traffic controller 3rd class put out calls for volunteers, since the station is not required to maintain weekend search and rescue watches. A lieutenant commander, who was also a pilot and flight support officer, organized a team of volunteers and lifted off in an H-3 helicopter at 5:15 a.m. Because this Navy helicopter was the only aircraft amongst the impromptu response fleet with a rescue swimmer on board, this team of volunteers would soon play a critical role in the rescue efforts. Just prior, though, while these aircraft were prepping to get underway, that tank ship Tropic Sun began racing towards the Marine Electric to try and help. The Tropic Sun was 35 nautical miles north of the capsized vessel, almost the same distance away as the Point Highland, but the Tropic Sun could only make about 17 knots. The Norwegian tank ship Berganger was also contacted and began accelerating towards the Marine Electric. Though the Berganger was 6 nautical miles closer than the Tropic Sun, it couldn't make the same speed. And as a side note, we did a ton of digging trying to get to the bottom of why each report refers to this, quote, Norwegian tank ship so differently. The U.S. Coast Guard report spells it Berganger. The NTSB spells it Bananger, and Robert Frump spells it Barranger. The only one of these names we could find any record of being an actual ship was the Berganger, or Berganger, as the Coast Guard spelled it. The first version on record was a merchant vessel reportedly sank in 1942 via U-boat attack. The vessel also was clearly not a tank ship, as it's described by both the NTSB and reporter Robert Frump. Although to make this a little more complicated, the actual vessel Berganger, I believe, could have been mistaken for a tank ship, was actually the Norwegian-flagged bulk cargo vessel Berganger IMO number 735-4292, which sailed under said name, according to these photos from at least 1975 through 85. It also wouldn't be the first time I've seen someone categorize a bulker as a tank ship or vice versa. Anyway, Coast Guard cutter Cherokee was also directed to make way toward the scene, as were the Navy vessels USS Jack Williams and USS Seattle, both approximately 70 nautical miles away. Given the temperature of the water, it appeared all 4 vessels would just be too far out to arrive in time, an aspect made even more frustrating in hindsight when considering the following. From the tank ship Tropic Sun's captain.
At 3:15, the radio telegraph auto alarm went off on the bridge. The SOS was from the Marine Electric, which was taking on water and readying its lifeboats for abandoning ship. The crew needed help as soon as possible. The Marine Electric was more than 35 miles from us. I changed course and informed the local Coast Guard station that we were responding to the SOS. On our way south to render aid, we saw an unwelcome sight, one that still makes me shake my head. Vessels that must have heard the Marine Electric's SOS sailing in the opposite direction.
The Marine Electric capsized at 4:15 a.m., only a little more than an hour after its first distress call. With no lifeboats successfully launched, and the life rafts inaccessible to many in the water, the clock was ticking on the crew's survival, almost fully exposed in brutal conditions. From the NTSB. At 4:16 a.m., the Tropic Sun reported that it was 24 nautical miles away from the Marine Electric, proceeding at 17 knots, and that the Norwegian tank ship Berganger was 6 nautical miles ahead of the Tropic Sun and also proceeding to the scene at a speed of 13 knots. Meanwhile, in the water, the crew fought on despite the seemingly impossible odds. The AB, who had managed to inflate a life raft and climbed into it with heroic effort, was unable to help his fellow crewmen into the raft with him, even though 4 people surrounded it and tried getting on board. One of the men in the water near the raft was the second mate. The NTSB continues. The AB found the ladder at the other end of the enclosed life raft and instructed the 4 persons in the water to go to the other end using the lifeline around the outside of the life raft. However, none of the persons in the water were able to get into the life raft. Exhausted and numbed by the cold, the 4 crew members surrounding the raft were obviously not thinking very clearly and had very little energy to spare. They couldn't seem to concentrate on the life-saving directions the AB was giving them. According to the AB, as reported by the NTSB, I had to repeat that at least 5 times to follow the line around to the other side of the raft, and there's a ladder over there. What the ladder consisted of was, I guess, what we call a cargo net. We went over there, and again, one of the guys, he grabbed a hold of that, and the other 2 guys had the lifeline on one side, and the second mate came around the other side, and I was trying to get the second mate in, and even with him, with that ladder, we couldn't get him in. He couldn't grab on top. The ladder was flush against the raft, on the top, and you couldn't reach down and get your hands into anything. I even tried to. I squashed the net up a little bit, and they had a little flap there. I tried to put his hand into there so he could hold on to that, and I grabbed something else, and we tried for a long time to get him in. I told him to get a foothold, see if he could get a foothold on the ladder. He said he couldn't do it. There wasn't one or whatever, and so he was really coherent. I was trying to get him in first because he was the most coherent, and he could help me get the other guys in. Finally, we tried every way we could, and I was pulling. Of course, we was all freezing. You know, our hands aren't all that good. It was cold. And then he put his legs up there, tried to get in that way. And after a while, I had him up to his knees. His knees were on top of the raft, and his head was in the water down that way, and I was losing him. That way he was falling asleep and drifting off. So after I couldn't get them in, the second mate, he was the first one to drift away. I guess he was struggling. And then after that, I went to try to look for something, kept on looking for something to help him with. And then they all started drifting away one by one. Towards the end, one of the guys that was hanging onto the ladder, that's when he tried the hardest. And he didn't last too long after that. They would just drift away. Because they didn't have the strength or dexterity to grip the rope ladder and pull themselves up, eventually the men who surrounded the AB's inflated life raft fell away one by one, falling victim presumably to hypothermia and or drowning. The AB left alone in the freezing storm. By himself in the dark, witnessing the death of his 4 companions, the AB turned off his little $1.29 flashlight to conserve the battery, sat back in the life raft, and awaited either rescue or the end. Nearby, the third mate was fighting a battle of his own, swimming on his back until he found 5 other people clinging to a single life ring. Possibly one of those life rings he'd thrown off the deck himself mere moments prior. Surrounding this life ring were the chief engineer, the 12-4 third mate, the radio operator, an OS, and the deck utility man. But just like the men surrounding the AB's raft, one by one, these men went silent and fell away. From the NTSB, according to the third mate. I don't know when I started to notice that people weren't on the life ring. I noticed that the OS wasn't there at one time, and then I turned around and the deck utility man wasn't there. Right after, I called out to the 12 to 4 third mate, and I asked him how he was doing. He responded that he was okay, that he was cold, he was okay. I don't know how long I was on the life ring before I noticed that the only ones there were the chief engineer and the radio operator. The radio operator kept saying he was cold, and he was stiffening up. He kept saying, I'm cold, help me." At that point, I noticed that the chief engineer, when we went into the water, had his spotlight, and he had been shining it up into the air all this time. I noticed that he wasn't shining it anymore. I thought he might have lost it, so I whacked him on the back of his life jacket, and there was no response from the chief. And as I hit him, his flashlight floated away from him, and I was able to grab that and use that as my signal. Again, I never looked at my watch in the water because I was afraid that I would lose my grip on the ring, so I wasn't concerned with the time element. I kept talking to the radio operator. He was the last one on the ring with me. Though the others had at least started in groups, the chief mate had been alone in his swamped lifeboat from the beginning. From Robert Frump's book, written from interviews with the chief mate. He found that sitting up did not work. The waves crested and broke. It was as if he were sitting at the shoreline in heavy surf. Tons of water would crash over him and push and pull him. It was all he could do to stay in the boat. He was determined to stay out of the water, but the wind was ripping him, the water was draining him. But if he curled up in the bottom of the boat and braced himself sideways, half wedged under the seat, he could hold his own, and it was less exposed, warmer down there. The lifeboat was filled with water, just barely buoyant. He could stay crouched down, with just his head out. The coat his wife B had given him was tight at the sleeves and waist. He thought it might be functioning like a wetsuit, holding the water there, warming it, giving him an extra layer of protection. And the waves still rocked him. Every 11 to 14 seconds, a huge breaker would wash over him. He would have to press against the boat, hold on with the frozen meat hooks he had for hands, and hold his breath. Being in the boat was worse than swimming in the open seas in that sense. It was exhausting. The chief mate thought about just letting go. He knew that he was one of the oldest crew members on board and that no one would be surprised or blame him if he did not survive. But he had recently been listening to the music of Canadian folk singer Stan Rogers, and lyrics from the song The Mary Ellen Carter popped into his head and would not go away. The song was about a ship that had sunk and then been salvaged through the determination of its crew. He began singing the lyrics out loud, shouting against the storm to give himself hope and something to live for.
Here we go. Rise again, rise again.
Rise again, rise again. Though your heart it be broken and life about to end, no matter what you've lost, be it home, a love, a friend. Then like the Mary Ellen Carter, rise again. From Robert Frump's book. It seemed like hours to the chief mate that he bellowed that song, then held his breath and thrashed, then bellowed the song again. He thought he could see hints of dawn, traces of light to the east. It gave him hope. The hope, the thoughts, the song, they all fought the urge to sleep, the voice that told him to breathe the water. And he said to himself, swore to himself then, if I get out of this, I will not care, I will never be afraid. I'll say these things, I'll do these things. At 5:20 a.m., more than an hour after the Marine Electric capsized, dumping so many crew members into the freezing waters of the Atlantic, the Coast Guard helo Pelican 1471 arrived, chosen because it could carry up to 15 survivors at a time, the first rescue unit on scene. However, what the helo crew saw was turbulent waters littered with floating mariners, nearly all of them in the sea. The helo crew was immediately dismayed. According to the U.S. Coast Guard, the Chief of Search and Rescue in the 5th District recounted, "That was the first indication that we had from anyone that the survivors were not actually in the boats. The transmissions that we had from the Marine Electric which occurred from 2:51 a.m. until they actually indicated they were abandoning ship at 4:13 a.m., led us to believe that it was a fairly sequenced event, that they did have boats and rafts, all the crew were in life jackets, and that they would take to their boats and rafts, and we would find them in those boats and rafts. As soon as the aircraft got on scene, we knew right away that was not the case. When the pilot of Pelican 1471 arrived at 5:20 a.m., he saw many strobe lights in the water, but he knew that any men still alive would struggle to get into the helicopter's rescue equipment by themselves due to the frigid waters and the awkward maneuvers their rescue basket required. From the military news, at the time, Coast Guard flight crews did not have the ability or power to deploy rescue swimmers in the sea to recover victims. As strange as it may seem, a crew member simply lowered a rescue basket from the helicopter in the vicinity of a distressed person in the water. The rescue relied almost entirely on the victim mustering the strength to get in the basket on his or her own. In cold temperatures where shock and hypothermia were prevalent, this practice proved futile. While Pelican 1471 continued their search for survivors without the aid of a rescue swimmer, the Briganger, the Tropic Sun, and the Point Highland arrived at about 5:45 a.m. and began to search the waves for survivors. Fortunately, by 6:05 a.m., another helicopter, that Navy Sea King, Unit 737, arrived, carrying a rescue swimmer on board. From the Coast Guard's interview with the pilot of Pelican Unit 1434, Captain Mont J. Smith, Jr., the duty officer in the District RCC, or Rescue Coordination Center, had wisely alerted a closer rescue resource, a Navy Sea King Unit 737, that could join the effort from nearby Naval Air Station Oceana. This helicopter was used as a local base rescue resource during scheduled flight training operations for the master jet base. Since there was no flight activity underway, the crew was home in bed when RCC called. Nonetheless, they responded quickly and were airborne in under an hour. The aircraft commander of our other unit, Coast Guard Pelican 1471, was already communicating with the Navy helicopter as he neared the scene. The Navy crew had located the main debris field and had lowered their rescue swimmer into the water to try to lift possible survivors from the raging and tossing sea. 20 minutes later, that second Coast Guard helo, Pelican 1434, arrived on scene. 3 helos were now present, but by this point, the situation in the water was dire. Few waterlogged survivors still breathing were nearing physical incapacitation by the cold and their near full exposure to it. From the pilot of Pelican 1434, the victims, who were middle-aged and older men, were clothed only in their pajamas, indicating the ship had sunk so suddenly they only had time to rush from their bunk's topside, grab a life jacket, and jump into the frigid water. Unfortunately, the Navy helicopter was only equipped with a horse collar rescue sling, which was designed to clip onto the survival vest of their fellow naval aviators. Since none of the Marine Electric's crew members were wearing this type of vest, the Navy and Coast Guard quickly decided to collaborate by having the Navy rescue swimmer help wrestle survivors into the Coast Guard helicopter's rescue basket. The rescue swimmer, who had volunteered for this mission, faced incredible challenges. First, he was only wearing a wetsuit instead of a dry suit. From PADI, the Professional Association of Diving Instructors. The main difference between a wetsuit and a dry suit is their suitability in warm or cold water. Depending on thickness and personal tolerance, wetsuits are popular across tropical and temperate destinations. However, chillier temperatures below 10 degrees Celsius or 50 degrees Fahrenheit demand the added protection and warmth of a dry suit. In fact, they're mandatory in ice diving. With the water surface temperature at the scene only a few degrees above freezing, the rescue swimmer was risking death just by entering the water. He was also the only rescue swimmer at the scene, and the Marine Electric sank with 34 souls on board. In addition, after more than an hour in the water, the survivors could not aid in their own rescue, or in some cases even move at all. It didn't help that the remnants of the storm were still creating giant waves, with swells up to 25 feet high. The rescue swimmer was also working with a helicopter crew that he'd never served with before, or even met. Despite these difficulties, he prepared to drop in from the Navy Helo, while Coast Guard Helo 1471 began systematically trying to locate survivors from the air. From the Coast Guard's report, starting at the southern region of the rescue scene, Pelican 1471's pilot first noted an empty life raft. They proceeded to a second light, which was also a life raft, and found one person in it. This person was probably the AB, who was the only survivor that had managed to inflate a life raft and climb into it. Continued from the Coast Guard. When the AB heard the Coast Guard helicopter, he flashed his flashlight in the air. He said he wasn't too concerned about his rescue, since the raft was riding very well, with only 3 to 6 inches of water in the bottom. It was still dark when the helicopter lowered the rescue basket to him, but he said it was very shortly after his rescue that he saw daylight. He said he shivered all the time, but he felt that the security of being in the raft helped him calm down. It was just about dawn when the AB was airlifted via the rescue basket he was able to climb into himself. After this first survivor was safely in Pelican 1471, its pilot continued on until they found the life ring that the third mate had clung to. The Coast Guard continues. They passed over several strobe lights attached to ring buoys, and some strobe lights floating by themselves. About 30 yards away, a group of bodies were sighted. The helicopter was able to rescue one individual, the 8 to 12 third mate. The third mate was also able to climb into the basket himself, while the rescue swimmer aided those who were incapacitated. From militarynews.com's interview with the rescue swimmer, my main concern was to get as many crewmen out of that cold water and into the helicopter. Everybody I came to was immobile. It was hard to put each one in the basket because of the 20 to 25 foot swells going over my head. Nevertheless, the rescue swimmer was able to load 3 people into the rescue basket on his own in terrible conditions. Unfortunately, none of them would be survivors. From the NTSB, the rescue swimmer placed 3 persons into the U.S. Coast Guard rescue basket, but all 3 were found to be dead when they were hoisted into the helicopter. Shortly afterward, the rescue swimmer began to show signs of hypothermia, and the pilot of the Coast Guard helicopter hoisted him from the water. During these monumental efforts aboard the helicopters, the Briganger, Point Highland, and Tropic Sun were also desperately trying to find people who were still left alive in the water. From the U.S. Coast Guard. At 6:03 a.m., the Briganger reported sighting 2 life rafts, both empty. At 6:15 a.m., the Point Highland began recovering bodies from the sea, and had the 2 life rafts alongside. To assist them, the Point Highland launched their small Zodiac-like rigid inflatable boat with a 2-man crew. The Tropic Sun and Briganger searched for bodies and provided a lee for the Point Highland's recovery efforts. From Pelican 1434's pilot via Coast Guard interview, we began to see lifeless bodies floating erect in old World War II-style Kapok life jackets. Incredibly, many appeared to be dressed in nothing more than pajamas or work clothes. They were ghostly white and limp, bathed in the illumination of our lights. We scanned the first person we encountered very intently. His eyes were wide open. He looked to be in his 50s with gray hair. His right arm was raised, and as he rose and fell on each wave, it seemed to beckon us. I was reminded of Ahab in the novel Moby Dick. We all began to chatter on the intercom system, or ICS. The pilot stated over comms, "What do you think? Could he be alive?" The flight mechanic responded, "Yeah, maybe he's so hypothermic it's all he can do to move his arm." The co-pilot replied, "Maybe he's trying desperately to get our attention." The corpsman stated, "If you can get him into the helicopter, I can revive him with the oxygen." The avionics man volunteered, "I'll go down on the hoist, Commander." Though the avionics man had been trained in water survival, like all members of the Coast Guard at this time in history, he'd not practiced any cold water rescues as a rescue swimmer. The Coast Guard's rescue swimmer program didn't even exist yet. The unit's commander, the pilot, was torn as to whether to even allow the avionics man to go down in the basket to try and help victims to climb in. But in the end, he allowed it. From Pelican 1434's pilot. Was it really a reasonable thing to put a crewman in the water? We were trained in water survival, But it's one thing to get in the pool once a year and practice putting on your wetsuit, inflating your life vest, and climbing in and out of a raft. It's another thing to be in the open ocean, untethered, dealing with slashing seas and a hurricane-force rotor wash. And that's just considering your own survival. What about struggling to help another individual who may be incapacitated? Or the danger of getting entangled in debris? Or encountering creatures of the deep? There were literally dozens of considerations. In retrospect, I realized this was very hasty and ill-advised. Yet here we were, pondering this potential life-or-death situation. We all felt helpless. The only way to describe our emotion was compelling. We were looking at another human in acute distress, and it was a universal feeling. There was no way to know if the man was dead or alive, but we had to try something. And they did try. Twice they lowered their basket. The first time was successful. They pulled a man from the water and immediately attempted resuscitation. The second time they tried, the hoist cable malfunctioned, and they were forced to either retreat or risk the life of their avionics man who was in the basket. Continued from 1434's pilot. When we arrived at the airport, our Marine Electric crew member was pronounced dead on arrival by the ambulance paramedic. It was the final toll of the bell for a tragic evening. Meanwhile, the constantly searching boats and helicopters laid eyes on another survivor. At 6:37 a.m., almost 2.5 hours after the Marine Electric sank, the Briganger spotted the chief mate, still clinging to his sinking lifeboat. Barely alive, but singing his heart out. From until the sea shall free them. At daylight, the Norwegian tanker Briganger saw a strange sight, a swamped lifeboat, international orange in color. It carried one man. He seemed to duck down as the waves broke over him. Then it looked as if he were shouting, or singing. The Briganger moved closer. Jacob's ladders and nets were thrown overboard. Crewmen braved the pitch of the ship and the sweep of the waves and went down the nets to give the chief mate a hand. Below, the chief mate still had his faculties. He knew the danger of this sort of rescue. Rescue was just a few feet away. It was so tempting. But waves were cresting at up to 27 feet, he calculated, judging from the length of the lifeboat. There are abundant stories of men who died just inches from rescue because their boats were crushed against the hull of a large ship. Cusick knew this. So did the captain of the Briganger, as the two veteran mariners stared at each other across the waves. His boat was swamped and he could not steer it. If by chance he came near the ship, he could not grip anything authentically. His hands were dumb, weak hooks. The lifeboat would almost certainly be smashed, dumping him into the water and his death, he thought. The chief mate had been at sea long enough to know it. The Norwegian captain realized it as well. He saw the chief mate in the lifeboat. The old mate was waving him off. He was saying thanks, but waving him off. The two officers' eyes met. They understood. In summary from the NTSB, the master of the Briganger had maneuvered his ship alongside the lifeboat containing the chief mate, and had lowered a ladder and net over the side. Crewmen from the Briganger climbed down the ladder and net in an attempt to rescue the chief mate, but the sea was too rough. Because it looked impossible for the chief mate to be rescued by boat, Pelican 1471, which had already successfully rescued the AB and third mate, made one final attempt to also lift the chief mate to safety. Continued from the NTSB. The helicopter lowered its rescue basket, hoisted the chief mate into the helicopter, and then departed the scene with the 3 survivors aboard, bound for Salisbury, Maryland. The chief mate would be the final crew member of the Marine Electric to be pulled from the water alive. The Navy helicopter departed at 7 a.m. and was replaced shortly afterwards by the Navy frigate USS Jack Williams and the replenishment ship USS Seattle. They were eventually joined by Coast Guard cutters Cherokee and Point Arena. Now began the difficult but important task of victim recovery. Pelican 1434 picked up 2 bodies, while the Point Highland recovered 16, and the Cherokee recovered 3. The Point Highland then sailed to Chincoteague with all 19 bodies recovered by the 2 cutters, while the Cherokee stayed behind and continued the search. According to the Coast Guard, the overturned stern of the Marine Electric remained visible until approximately 11:30 a.m. Down by the bow, the stern portion sticking out, presumably unapproachable, when it finally gave in and sank in roughly 120 feet of water. Difficult for this narrator to think, especially, of those potentially trapped in engineering. As the day progressed, most of the other ships were released from the search. The Cherokee pulled the lifeboat that had saved the chief mate out of the water, but deliberately sank the 2 life rafts so they would not confuse further search efforts. As the Coast Guard helicopters and the Navy vessels departed the scene, the Point Arena continued to search throughout the night, finally departing at 4 a.m. the next morning, Sunday, February 13th. From the NTSB. On Sunday, February 13th, a final helicopter search was conducted between 9:24 a.m. and 11:30 a.m. The active search was suspended at 5:37 p.m. when the Cherokee departed the scene. 4 U.S. Coast Guard and U.S. Navy aircraft spent 11.9 hours searching, and U.S. Coast Guard, U.S. Navy, and merchant vessels spent 93 hours searching the scene. The air search then extended for a period of 2 days and comprised a total of 28 hours flying time. According to the NTSB, 7 crew members remained unaccounted for. The captain, the first assistant engineer, the second assistant engineer, 2 of the third assistant engineers, the engineering cadet, and 1 engine man. Determined searches by various parties continued for days. In total, after the heroic efforts of so many involved, there were 3 survivors rescued, immediately taken to hospital and treated for hypothermia. 24 victims recovered, deceased, and those 7 crew members never found were ultimately presumed lost. In the aftermath of Marine Electric's incident, there were loads of finger-pointing. The company that owned the vessel, Marine Transport Lines, or MTL, was quick to name accidental grounding during the rescue of fishing vessel Theodora as cause of the casualty. This could have benefited MTL, as making the ship and crew look heroic had the potential to free their parent company of any fault. However, Chief Mate Cusick immediately and publicly refuted that claim. So it may come as no surprise that MTL then blamed the chief mate for either improperly loading the Marine Electric, maintaining the vessel poorly, or not securing the anchor, which then purportedly gouged holes into the vessel, causing the sinking. Chief Mate Cusick fortunately had documentation of the many times he'd informed MTL about the vessel's deteriorating condition, including pictures he'd drawn that showed every single patch in the hatch covers, for instance. According to the records at the loading dock, the chief mate had also followed loading procedures, and the U.S. Coast Guard officially cleared him of overloading the ship as well. From the U.S. Coast Guard. The Marine Electric, on its departure from Norfolk, Virginia, on February 10, 1983, was not overstressed or overloaded. Although the SAG numeral was exceeded by 6 to 7%, the detailed and conservative stress calculations made in the Coast Guard's technical report showed the hull was operated within its design limits. With the help of a diver who took hundreds of photos of the wreck, the chief mate was also able to prove that the anchor could not have done enough damage to cause the Marine Electric to capsize, and that it was unlikely the anchor had been poorly secured in the first place. Various massive investigations into the sinking of the Marine Electric were funded at times by the Coast Guard, the NTSB, MTL, and even the families of the victims, investigations that dragged on for months. Dive teams were hired by multiple parties to photograph and video the wreck, partially to decide who should officially shoulder the blame, as the parties involved sued each other from all sides. After all these efforts, it became clear to everyone that there had been flooding in the forward compartments. From the NTSB. Based on the survivors' testimony and U.S. Coast Guard records, at about 3:50 a.m., the Marine Electric developed a 5-degree starboard list, which gradually increased until it capsized about 25 minutes later. Trim and stability calculations performed after the accident indicated that to develop a 5-degree to 8-degree trim by the bow would have required at least flooding the number 1 and 2 cargo holds and most of the spaces forward of the collision bulkhead, A 5-degree starboard list would have required flooding both numbers 1 and 2 starboard wing tanks. A 40-knot beam wind would have produced a list of about 0.5 degrees. Flooding the number 1 starboard wing ballast tank alone would have resulted in a 2-degree heel, and flooding numbers 1 and 2 starboard wing tanks would have resulted in a 4.5 degree heel. All 3 survivors recall overhearing or being informed between 3 and 3:50 a.m., and the safety board concludes that the engineers were pumping out the numbers 1 and 2 starboard wing tanks. The 5-degree list at 3:50 a.m. was probably the result of flooding of those tanks. As the bow went deeper into the water, the marine electric gradually lost stability. However, the asymmetrical flooding would have only increased the list rather than caused the ship to capsize. The sudden capsizing at 4:15 a.m. probably was the result of the loss of all positive stability, as the bow went deeper underwater, and not further asymmetrical flooding of the wing tanks. Nearly all parties eventually agreed that the marine electric went down by the head because of flooding in its bow. The remaining dispute revolved around why these compartments flooded initially, with the NTSB and Coast Guard developing competing ideas as to probable cause. The NTSB provided 4 scenarios as to initial cause, stating, quote, "Based on the available evidence and testimony, the safety board could not determine the cause of the flooding in the marine electric's forward compartments. However, there are several possible causes, including 1. Grounding damage, 2. Hatch cover failure, 3. Damage caused by the anchor, and 4. Hull structural failure." Regarding the NTSB's first scenario, vessel grounding, the chief mate vehemently denied that any grounding occurred during their attempt to aid Theodora, and neither of the other surviving crew members remembered experiencing ground strike either. Additionally, the relief captain, who was in constant communication with the Coast Guard at the time, never mentioned ground strike during the Theodora's rescue nor afterwards, when the Marine Electric's bow began to struggle. A diver sent down to videotape the Marine Electric as it lay on the ocean floor did document some bow damage, but it was concluded that damage had occurred after the bow sank, and not via ground strike. The NTSB then ruled out grounding as the initial cause. They continue. The videotapes at the bottom of the Marine Electric's bow section showed some damage, but none indicating that the bow had grounded. Since the 2 nearest shoal areas were 4.5 to 6 nautical miles to the north-northwest of the Marine Electric's position when it parted company with the Theodora, since the Marine Electric probably steered an easterly course after leaving the Theodora, and since there were no communications or testimony suggesting a grounding, the safety board believes that grounding damage was not a factor in the flooding of the forward compartments. The U.S. Coast Guard agreed that grounding had not occurred, stating, quote, "No evidence was found to indicate that the vessel had suffered any grounding damages prior to the casualty. The relative location fixes taken by the Marine Electric showed that at all times while escorting the Theodora, she had sufficient water under her keel and was clear of any shoal areas. Underwater examination of the wreck revealed no evidence of indentation or scrape marks on its bottom plating that could be attributed to a grounding." The next scenario the NTSB looked into was hatch cover failure. This seemed far more plausible than grounding, but the NTSB's research concluded that even if the hatch covers suffered 75% wastage, they should still have been able to endure 2 feet of standing water, or 1 foot deep pounding waves. Since the Marine Electric had at least 21 feet of freeboard at its bow when it sailed, even with the height of the waves in the storm, something must have happened to lower the bow significantly before there could have been enough water on top of the hatches for them to fail. From the NTSB, when the third mate observed a 5-degree to 8-degree forward trim at 3 a.m., the dry cargo hatch and the number 1 hatch covers were already underwater, with waves breaking on top of the hatch covers, and either the dry cargo hatch and or number 1 hatch cover could well have failed. However, the hatch covers probably did not fail until after some factor reduced the freeboard at the bow, i.e. flooding of some of the forward compartments. Although the Marine Electric experienced 20 to 25 foot significant waves on February 11th, which decreased to 15 to 20 foot waves on the early morning of February 12th. The safety board believes that a hatch cover failure was not the initial cause of the flooding of forward compartments. So, while it's plausible and even likely that the hatch covers eventually failed, causing the Marine Electric to sink more rapidly, and likely contributing to its capsizing, according to the NTSB at least, the hatch covers were almost certainly not the initial cause of the accident, although the Coast Guard directly disagreed and blamed the hatch covers along with deck wastage as initial points of failure, stating, quote, "The cause of the casualty was due to progressive flooding of the vessel's forward spaces. The sequence of events most likely commenced with flooding through sections of the deteriorated and wasted top plating of the dry cargo hatch and wasted main deck plating, subjected to the dynamic effects of the striking sea, resulting in filling the dry cargo spaces, store spaces, and the deep tanks. The chain locker may have filled to some degree as a result of water entering through the spill pipe, a non-watertight deck fitting." We will delve into this interpretation of events by the Coast Guard in a moment, but the third scenario the NTSB investigated was that an improperly secured anchor could have punched enough holes in the bow to allow significant downflooding. When divers went to check on the anchors of the Marine Electric, the starboard anchor was missing, but there was no indication of whether or not the anchor and chain had released before the ship capsized. There was a large amount of damage on the vessel's starboard side, and there were several sharp punctures in the starboard shell plating that could have been caused by the anchor. But there were so many fail-safes for anchor storage that the NTSB considered this highly unlikely, stating, quote, "Even though the Devil's Claw turnbuckle was found almost fully open, which indicated that the claw may have come loose and fallen off the chain during the rolling of the ship, the chain stopper or pawl, if properly engaged, should have held the anchor in place while the vessel was upright. In addition, the break of the anchor windlass should also have held the anchor." The NTSB considered that it was far more probable that the anchor came loose after the ship was already in the process of sinking, and that it was very unlikely to have caused the incident. Quote, "The safety board believes it is improbable that the Devil's Claw, the chain stopper, and the anchor windlass break all failed while the ship was upright. When the Marine Electric capsized to starboard, the Devil's Claw may have come loose. Since the chain stopper was held in place by gravity, it would open as the ship capsized. The anchor could then have been released if the anchor windlass break had also failed, as the starboard side hit bottom. It could have caused damage on the starboard side of the bow, including the punctures aft and above the starboard hawse pipe." The Coast Guard agreed with this finding, with additional conclusions of their own, stating, "The starboard anchor was secured when the vessel put out to sea on February 10, 1983. The Devil's Claw was in place. The recovery of the Devil's Claw turnbuckle showed it opened nearly the full extent, but still sufficiently tightened to provide threaded holding strength of the unit, since steam was used to freewheel the windlass when the temperature reached 28 degrees Fahrenheit. The windlass was out of gear and the brake engaged. The chain stopper was engaged on the chain. It is most probable the starboard anchor let go when the ship rolled and capsized. On its starboard side, the Devil's Claw would have fallen off, the chain slacked over the Wildcat, and the chain stopper opened, allowing the anchor to run free. The chief mate heard a rumbling when the vessel capsized. This may have been the anchor letting go. The pounding of the hull on the bottom while the stern was partially buoyant could account for the eventual fouling and parting of the anchor and chain." In addition to the official findings, the chief mate was certain that he had made a special effort to secure the anchor because of the rough weather. Continued from the Coast Guard. The chief mate made his report to the bridge that the ship was secured for sea and made specific mention of the spill pipe plates and Devil's Claws being attached. Which leaves us with the NTSB's final potential scenario, that the Marine Electric's hull had experienced a structural failure. This was also plausible given the many structural failures of T2 tankers in the past. By this time period, more than a dozen T2s had experienced catastrophic hull failures, some of them while floating in peaceful harbors during fair weather. The Marine Electric had undergone a hull extension procedure that lengthened the ship significantly, a procedure that the U.S. Coast Guard afterwards officially recommended against. and even though the ship also had installed crack arresters, those had proven to not be enough to save other T2s. Similar in principle to doubler plates, only on a larger scale, crack arresters by their very nature, as we discussed earlier in the video, are a haphazard, temporary solution at best, the goal in shipbuilding being to not need them in the first place. The Marine Electric's hull, like other T2s, also consisted of a steel potentially more brittle than modern steel, and there were some public doubts about using welding rather than riveting as a ship construction method, so a sudden hull failure, while tragic, also remains plausible. Adding to the credibility of this scenario, divers on the wreck also observed a hull fracture in one of the forward cargo holds. Continued from the NTSB. Underwater video camera and diver surveys showed that the hull fractured in the number 2 cargo hold. Although the hull may have fractured when the ship hit the ocean bottom, a structural failure and flooding in the number 2 cargo hold shell plating, while the ship was on the surface, would explain the forward trim. The propagation of this fracture into the number 2 starboard wing tank also would explain the reported pumping of starboard wing tanks and the starboard list. Now, the starboard side of the bow could have also fractured, but the intensity of the vessel's sinking caused so much damage on that side it became difficult to positively confirm whether there had been a hull failure in that particular area. The NTSB would go on to say, "It is possible that a structural failure may have occurred on the starboard side of the bow forward of the collision bulkhead. However, evidence of the initiation of such a failure is masked by the large amount of damage in this area. Such a structural failure would have caused flooding of the dry cargo stores and deep tanks forward, and would have caused a trim angle of about 0.8 degrees, with the resulting freeboard of 16 feet. This could have led to waves breaking over and collapsing the number 1 hatch cover, and allowing the flooding in the number 1 cargo hold." In the end, the NTSB decided that it seemed very likely that the Marine Electric suffered a hull failure in one or more places during the pounding of an intense storm that was also cold enough to make its inferior steel even more brittle than usual, especially with the vessel in such poor condition, which was documented and reported thoroughly over the years. Continued from the NTSB. The Safety Board believes that the most probable cause of initial flooding was a structural failure on the starboard side of the number 2 cargo hold. Since the structural calculations performed after the accident, based on 2-year-old hull gaugings, indicate that the Marine Electric's hull strength was within design limits, and the stresses and bending moments calculated for the ship, as loaded on February 11th and 12th, were within design limits, the structural failure probably was the result of a local stress concentration. Local wastage was probably responsible for this stress concentration because the sea state on February 11th and 12th probably was not as severe as many vessels of similar design have experienced in the North Atlantic Ocean, where even more severe winter storms are common. The structural calculations show that the longitudinal bending and shear stresses would have been reduced with forward compartments flooded, indicating that a structural failure more likely would have occurred with the ship intact than with forward compartments flooded. It is notable that the U.S. Coast Guard directly disagreed with this complex assessment, complex in my own words, while they also surmised that flooding in the forward compartments had led to the bulker's demise. They thought that hatch cover incursion and permeations of the wasted deck plating were the most likely initial causes. The Coast Guard concluded that when the water pounded the wasted portions of the deck and those miserable hatch covers, it was able to seep into the forward compartments, and once those compartments were sufficiently flooded and the bow was riding lower in the water, the increased weight and pressure of green water on the hatches caused their fragile covers to fail and flood rapidly. From the Coast Guard quote, "The additional weight from flooding forward significantly reduced the freeboard at the bow, allowing greater amounts of seawater to board the vessel. Eventually, the force and weight of the boarding sea striking the top plating of number 1 and number 2 cargo hatch covers exceeded the strength of the deteriorated and wasted sections of the unsupported plating, resulting in the collapse of these plates wholly or in part. Seawater then entered number 1 and number 2 cargo holds. The vessel settled into the water to a point where its riding arm was so reduced that the Marine Electric became unstable and capsized. A starboard list commenced about 20 minutes before the vessel capsized. The list was most likely produced by a cargo shift or wind heel on the port side as the stability became increasingly tender. In addition, it's also important to consider liquefaction of bulk cargoes like this, even pulverized coal, especially with a full cargo hold. If this cargo were to become saturated enough, even slowly, by, say, a leaking, non-weathertight cargo hatch, the free surface effect of a coal and water slurry sloshing around in the hold could end up devastating to a ship's stability. This can take place with a moisture amount that wouldn't necessarily have been enough to sink a ship of this size alone, but mixed into a pulverized cargo can create a slow-moving, semi-liquid mixture, almost like cement, encouraged by either the ship's pitch or roll, creeps to one side or the other of the cargo hold, potentially creating a stability situation like that aboard Marine Electric. I'll leave a link in description for more details on bulk cargo liquefaction by Chief McCoy, where he discusses bauxite as an extreme example of this phenomenon.
Although bauxite looks like an inert and harmless substance, it is potentially one of the most dangerous cargoes that ships can carry. When we hear dangerous cargo, most of us might immediately have images of explosive or highly toxic substances. But for dry cargoes such as bauxite, the real danger lies in its tendency towards liquefaction and dynamic separation. These two phenomena have caused bulk carrier ships to sink within minutes, and in the past 10 years have claimed the lives of more than 100 seafarers. How would something like cargo liquefaction or dynamic separation sink a huge ship within a span of 20 minutes? Liquefaction takes place when loosely packed, waterlogged sediments lose their strength and turn into a fluid-like mass in response to strong vibrations or shaking. So in essence, it will behave like a liquid and will have the tendency to flow. There are other cargoes that are also susceptible to liquefaction, such as nickel ore, iron ore, and some types of coal, to name a few. So what if the cargo is verified to be susceptible to liquefaction? What can the captain do about it? When our ship was loading bauxite, I asked the captain the exact same question, and he actually had a lot of experience dealing with cargo disputes, including bauxite. He told me that there was this one time it had been raining heavily for a few days, and the cargo was just piled up in the open and exposed to the rain. Naturally, if it's raining, cargo operations will be suspended, but when the rain stopped and the loading resumed, the bauxite was like mud.
The U.S. Coast Guard went on to indicate that given the evidence they'd recovered, they deduced it was probably not structural failure that sank the Marine Electric. Quote, "There was insufficient evidence in the technical studies, metallurgical studies, or witness statements to support a theory of a structural failure occurring prior to the capsizing and sinking. With conservative assumptions made for the vessel's condition based on gauging reports, vessel speed, and the sea conditions, the hull stresses stayed below about half the maximum allowable stresses provided by the ABS rules. No evidence of excessive pitting, stress cracking, or working areas was found during the 1981 dry docking or at any time subsequent to the casualty. The metallurgical studies revealed the hull steel failed in a ductile manner and not a brittle fracture." The Coast Guard also made sure to mention how deeply damaged the hatch covers and deck plating were, and how likely it was that their failure was the initial cause, stating, quote, "The hatch covers were wasted, holed, deteriorated, epoxy patched, deflected, weakened, and missing securing devices and cross-joint wedges. In addition, the main deck plating was wasted between the hatches, and was repaired improperly at times with epoxy patches. The hatch covers were not considered to have been fit or satisfactory for their intended use from 1981 to the time of the casualty. Therefore, the vessel is in violation of its certificate of inspection." And important to note, throughout the process of heaving to and then aiding the Theodora and then going back to the heave to position, once they remained pointed in the one direction and the wind changed directions, all throughout this, there were various reports of water coming over the gunnels, water which could have leaked through all these wasted areas. Regardless of whether hull failures or hatch cover failures and deck incursions were the instigating cause of the sinking, there were several contributing factors which both agencies agreed compounded the damage and either caused the vessel to sink more rapidly or contributed to the incident's high death toll. For example, the NTSB and Coast Guard both seemed to think that the relief captain had made a preventable error when he didn't redirect the ship's heading once the wind shifted as the storm began to weaken. From the NTSB, the safety board cannot determine why the master did not change the heading of the Marine Electric and run before the sea when the adverse bow trim was first reported to him. If the master could have turned the ship safely under the sea conditions, he might have been able to assess the situation forward and determine the cause of the trim. The Coast Guard agreed with this, stating, "The contributing cause to the casualty was the failure of the relief master to take into consideration the effects of heavy boarding seas on the hatch covers and to maneuver his vessel accordingly." Now, the ship's regular captain made public remarks to the effect that if he'd been at the helm during this incident, he could have saved the ship, since he knew it better than the relief captain. This is indeed speculation and easy to say from the safety of shore. Still, it's possible that a redirection of the Marine Electric could have reduced the storm damage and allowed the vessel to hang on above the waves for longer while help arrived. For instance, while aiding fishing vessel Theodora, it became clear Marine Electric could not maintain the needed heading for much longer, as this put them at risk of taking too much green water over the gunnels. It was made clear early on that they needed to break off and resume a heading or position that allowed them to heave to safely and ride out the storm. However, later on that fateful early Saturday morning, as the wind and waves shifted and the bow began riding low, there seemed at least some awareness by the officers that both A, the seas were, quote, roaring down the deck, with green water again washing up, this time as far back as the number 2 hatch, but B, despite this, there seemed no attempt to adjust position accordingly and maintain a safe heave-to orientation to the storm. In addition to questions about the relief master's steering choices, both agencies debated the Marine Electric's pump covers. When hauling coal, the bilge pump was routinely covered with metal plates so that the bilge pipes didn't get clogged with coal dust. This obviously affected the crew's ability to pump water out of the cargo holds, a potentially deadly situation should those holds experience downflooding. From the Coast Guard, the vessel did not meet the Coast Guard Marine Engineering Regulations or ABS rules applicable to an effective cargo bilge pumping system. Solid plates had been installed over the bilge wells in the holds, which precluded pumping water out of the cargo holds. Consequently, the vessel was in violation of the provisions of the Certificate of Inspection. The NTSB concurred that covering the bilge pumps was a bad idea, but went on to say that even if they hadn't been covered, the coal dust would probably have clogged them anyway, stating, "The bilge wells in the cargo holds on the Marine Electric were covered with steel plates to prevent clogging of the suction piping by the pulverized coal cargo. Regardless of whether the bilge wells were covered with steel plates or by any other method, because of the nature of the cargo, it probably wouldn't have been possible to pump out the cargo holds if they had flooded." Both agencies agreed that being able to pump out the cargo holds would have been helpful, and not being able to use its pumps efficiently may have accelerated the ship's sinking. Finally, the two agencies also noted that the EPIRB, which had been set off, did not function like it was supposed to, thereby delaying rescue operations. Continued from the NTSB. The Marine Electric was equipped with a Martech whaler model EB-2BW EPIRB when it sank on February 12, 1983, but no signal was heard from the EPIRB by rescue personnel. The EPIRB had been inspected by the FCC on June 17, 1982, and the surviving third mate testified that before the Marine Electric capsized to starboard, he stood the EPIRB upright in its box on the port bridge wing. The safety board believes that the Marine Electric accident indicates there may be a continuing problem with this model of Martech EPIRB, and that the FCC should study a design change to improve its maintainability and reliability. And from the Coast Guard, the EPIRB failed to function and did not transmit its signal. The unit may have tangled in the wreck as it capsized to starboard and become trapped under the hull. A manufacturer's defect is also possible, since in 1980, a high failure rate was detected in the water-activated switch installed in this EPIRB type. Though a remote possibility the battery may have failed, the expiration date for the battery was January 1983. In its findings section, the NTSB also pointed out the many shortcomings of the safety inspection system that was run by the Coast Guard and their subcontractor, the American Bureau of Shipping, or ABS. From the NTSB, the ABS did not test the weather tightness of the Marine Electric's hatch covers at the last special survey in February 1981, as required by the ABS. The American Bureau of Shipping annual survey in February of '82 did not detect the extensive wastage which existed on the Marine Electric's hatch covers at the time. Subsequent to the February 24, 1981 hull gaugings, the Coast Guard structural inspections were limited in scope and were unlikely to have found any but the most severe areas of localized hull wastage. The NTSB specifically zeroed in on the lack of training and experience in the investigators that the Coast Guard and ABS employed to inspect and certify ocean-going vessels. The NTSB continues, the U.S. Coast Guard does not provide its inspectors with adequate guidance on their responsibilities for the inspection of items such as the weather tightness of hatch covers covered by the load line regulations, which are administered by the ABS. The NTSB also focused on the fact that many World War II ships would need to be watched more closely to prevent future disasters, due mostly to the age of those vessels and their many years in service. Quote, the U.S. Coast Guard does not provide its inspectors with adequate written guidance for the inspection of vessels over 20 years of age. Although they do not require more frequent gaugings of older vessels, the ABS rules for special surveys generally provide for stricter inspections on older vessels, and the U.S. Coast Guard and the ABS could enhance the safety of older vessels by requiring gauging of vessels over 20 years of age at more frequent intervals. The ABS does not have adequate procedures for determining the structural strength of steel hatch covers after the hatch covers have been in service for a long period of time. Finally, the NTSB concentrated on how the drastic loss of life in the Marine Electric casualty was increased by a lack of immersion suits, usable life rafts, or a functioning EPIRB, stating, the crew of the Marine Electric was not provided with adequate protective equipment for abandoning ship in the cold environment, which contributed to the death of 20 persons from hypothermia. The boarding ladders and hand grabs on the U.S. Coast Guard approved life rafts were not adequate for their intended purpose and prevented several crew members from successfully boarding the life rafts. The Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, needs to take further action to assure the reliability of the Martech Whaler EB-2BW EPIRB. While the NTSB conceded that the ancient life boat release mechanisms probably slowed the escape of the crew, they fell short of officially blaming that for increased deaths. Quote, the sheath screw-type davits with manila falls installed on the Marine Electric, although more difficult to use than modern gravity davits, did not contribute to the loss of life. In addition, the NTSB also did not hold the Coast Guard at fault for the delay in launching their rescue helicopters. After all, if the EPIRB had been functioning like it should have, the Coast Guard wouldn't have had to waste valuable time manually confirming the location of the accident site. Also, they had to remove those pumps from the helicopter to make room for survivors. From the NTSB, although the earlier arrival of the U.S. Coast Guard rescue helicopter probably would have saved some lives, the Coast Guard responded reasonably timely under the severe weather conditions. The additional time required to launch the ready helicopter was used in evaluating the severe weather conditions and to verify the reported position of the Marine Electric. Finally, the NTSB pitched an idea that would go down in history as one of the great inflection points for Coast Guard search and rescue capabilities. From the NTSB, the use of rescue swimmers by the U.S. Coast Guard during search and rescue operations would improve its capability of recovering survivors, especially when the effects of hypothermia limit the ability of survivors to aid in their own rescue. This suggestion, along with the U.S. Coast Guard's own experience in the Marine Electric's daring rescue, would lead directly to the creation of the now venerable Rescue Swimmer Program, which we will cover in a bit. In their lessons learned and recommendation sections, there were some contradictory rulings, but both the NTSB and U.S. Coast Guard agreed that the current ship inspection system, which the Coast Guard had partially outsourced to ABS, had some major gaps and was inherently biased towards letting vessels continue to run. The NTSB recommended that this issue be solved with more training for inspectors and stricter regulations with a few more checks and balances, especially for older vessels, and particularly for hatch covers. An apt analog to the get there itis you hear in the aviation industry would be the just one more trip syndrome you see in the maritime industry. From the NTSB, require that structural gaugings of vessels be conducted at 2-year intervals after a vessel reaches 20 years of age. Require that steel weather deck hatch covers be gauged at all special surveys. Require surveyors to examine hatch covers for wastage during all annual load line surveys. Provide written guidance to U.S. Coast Guard inspectors regarding the inspection of vessels over 20 years of age, including specific structural gauging, equipment renewal, and testing requirements. Provide written guidance to U.S. Coast Guard inspectors specifying their responsibility for the inspection of items, such as the weather tightness of hatch covers, that have been delegated to the American Bureau of Shipping under the load line regulations. The U.S. Coast Guard was even more strict in holding itself accountable. The Coast Guard recommended that the ABS not be used anymore, since it wasn't a government agency, but was instead self-governed by its members and customers, which meant it was often put into the position of policing the very companies who paid for its services. This created conflicts of interest, and it's crucial those in charge in industries like this be able to spot them. It also meant that the ABS was perhaps being influenced in its evaluations. The ABS even publicly acknowledges that it represents the needs of its customers. From the American Bureau of Shipping and Drilling Systems Keystone Energy Tools website, for example. It's important to recognize that the ABS is not an agency of any government, nor does ABS inspect or certify ships, their equipment, or operations. It is privately owned and governed by its members, who comprise some 96% of the world's fleet. In addition, ABS represents not only the needs of its members, but also those of its customers, other ABS member societies, and the public at large. In 1984, when the report was originally published, the Coast Guard appeared to recommend moving away from using ABS or any private evaluation system for the sake of mariner safety, stating, "We recommend that the examination of U.S. merchant vessels to assure their compliance with the applicable federal safety statutes and regulations be conducted and determined by knowledgeable members of a U.S. government agency. The responsibilities for these functions should not be delegated or entrusted to the private sector." Now, it's important to note that this recommendation did not hold, and in 1995, the Coast Guard and ABS signed a Memorandum of Understanding that codified their continued cooperation with vessel inspections. From that memorandum, this Memorandum of Understanding, or MOU, delegates authority and sets forth guidelines for cooperation between the United States Coast Guard and the American Bureau of Shipping, or ABS, with respect to the initial and subsequent inspections for certification and periodic inspections or examinations of vessels of the United States, as defined by 46 U.S.C. Section 2101, Part 46. Both in the United States and in foreign countries, in the review and approval of plans, the tonnage measurement of vessels, and in associated activities. Nothing in this MOU alters in any way the statutory or regulatory authority of the Coast Guard or the rules, services, and responsibilities of the ABS related to vessel classification. The Coast Guard also recommended that their entire inspection process be put under a microscope by a panel of experts, and that it undergo a major overhaul. The Coast Guard continues, "It's recommended that the Commandant commission a panel to conduct an in-depth review of the entire Coast Guard commercial vessel safety program and make recommendations to him. The panel should consist of no less than 50% marine inspection retired officers in charge, recognized for their vessel inspection expertise, and recognized for for their merchant marine background. The Coast Guard went on to spell out specific regulation and inspection changes they felt were needed, especially when it came to postponing dry dock inspections, improving hatch cover testing, checking metal wastage against scantlings, and monitoring doubler plate repairs. From the U.S. Coast Guard, it's recommended that the Coast Guard publish a policy to define the reasons and vessel inspection criteria that must be followed before granting a vessel an extension of its dry docking date. Requests for such an extension should not be entertained unless the reasons are beyond the owner's or operator's control. It's recommended that the Commandant publish a policy concerning the examination, repair, and testing of metal hatch covers, with emphasis not only on the watertight or weathertight integrity of the covers, but the strength of them as well. The policy should address gauging and hose testing the covers periodically. That a regulation be promulgated to require any vessel which holds a load line certificate to have on board a shell expansion plan annotated to display the hulls required and as-built scantlings. This plan is to be made available to the marine inspector during times of dry docking and hull repairs. That the guidance found in the Coast Guard's notes on inspection and repair of steel hulls, NVIC 7-68, be amended to further restrict the use of doublers as a permanent repair to vessel structures or fittings contributing to the ship's strength or watertightness. Doubler repairs, when permitted, should be a matter of permanent record and be subject to periodic reevaluation. Another recommendation that the NTSB and Coast Guard agreed on was that the brand of EPIRB the Marine Electric had on board must be officially checked for design flaws and failure rates. Also, both agencies didn't just blame the life raft entry method for additional loss of life. They also suggested there be an inquiry into better designing life rafts that crew members could climb into more easily, even with reduced capabilities in the cold. From the NTSB, conduct a design study to determine the adequacy of existing boarding systems of U.S. Coast Guard approved inflatable life rafts regarding the marking of the location and ease of rigging of boarding ladders or equivalent, and the ability of persons in the water, including those wearing exposure suits, to use the boarding ladder and handholds or equivalent, and require design changes encompassing both new and existing life rafts found to have inadequate boarding systems. And from the Coast Guard, it's recommended that the Coast Guard propose regulations requiring improved boarding arrangements into inflatable life rafts by persons afflicted by injuries or cold. Modifications of existing life rafts should be required to improve the handhold arrangements of the boarding ladders. The NTSB individually recommended that more investigation be put into ensuring that bilge pumps worked on all ocean-going vessels, even those carrying pulverized coal. From the NTSB, evaluate the design of the bilge pumping systems in the cargo holds of U.S. flag bulk carriers in the coal trade, similar to the Marine Electric, to determine if the systems are compatible with the cargo and require modifications if necessary to those vessels which do not comply with U.S. Coast Guard regulations, that they may be operable under all practicable conditions. The NTSB also recommended that immersion suits be required gear for any mariner operating in cold water environments, another initiative that would lead to significant changes to the industry that would also go on to save many lives. Yet another inflection point. The NTSB continues. Require that exposure suits be provided for each crew member, scientific personnel, or industrial person on tank vessels, passenger vessels, cargo and miscellaneous vessels, mobile offshore drilling units, offshore supply vessels, small passenger vessels, and oceanographic vessels that operate in areas where the water temperature is below 60 degrees Fahrenheit. The Coast Guard individually recommended that flooding alarms should be placed in spots that were inaccessible to the crew, stating, "It's recommended that the Coast Guard propose regulations to ensure that vessels so constructed and operated with spaces which become inaccessible due to heavy weather or conditions of loading are fitted with flooding alarms capable of noting the control station of such condition." The Coast Guard also suggested that all old-fashioned lifeboat davits be replaced by the faster gravity davits that didn't require crew members to operate them. They continue, "It's recommended that all vessels currently fitted with quadrantal davits be required to install gravity davits for the launching of their lifeboats." Finally, the Coast Guard recommended that specific legal action be taken against the permanent or regular captain of the Marine Electric and the fleet director of MTL, recommending that the actions of the permanent master, Captain James K. Farnham, be referred to the U.S. Attorney for prosecution under 46 U.S.C. 186998, and that he took the Marine Electric to sea with unseaworthy and improperly repaired hatches and main deck areas, and with no effective cargo bilge pumping system on numerous occasions, and on 2 occasions in February 1983 with a hole in the port side shell. That the actions of Mr. Joseph Felge with respect to managing the repairs and maintenance of the Marine Electric while serving as MTL's fleet director be referred to the U.S. Attorney for prosecution under 46 U.S.C. 658. However, from the U.S. Naval Institute, quote, Farnham and Felge were not prosecuted because of insufficient evidence to prove their guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. After multiple court battles, though, the American legal system did determine that MTL owed the victims and their families reparations for the Marine Electric's sinking, though MTL never officially accepted blame for it. From the Journal of Commerce, all claims against marine transport lines have been settled for an estimated $15 million. In May 1985, months after the Coast Guard released its report, the shipping company agreed to pay $5.14 million to settle lawsuits brought by one survivor of the sinking and families of 14 men who died. The company did not admit liability, but Mr. Bright, a Norfolk lawyer who represented the seamen and families, said the Coast Guard findings had a dramatic effect on the amount the company was willing to pay to avoid a scheduled trial. The company later negotiated very satisfactory settlements brought by one survivor of the sinking and with the widow of a seaman who died. Perhaps the most significant outcomes of the Marine Electric disaster were the advances in mariner safety that it prompted. The Coast Guard Rescue Swimmer Program.
Back 5, swimmer's away, swimmer's okay. Going to move back in left 30, swimmer's 1 to your 1 o'clock. Back in left 20, swimmer's approaching around. Cease commands. Roger. Baskets in the water, easy back and left. Okay. Back in left 5. Roger. Hold. Hold. Swimmer's at the basket, easy forward. Okay. Try to take a load. Roger. Taking a load. Survivor's out of the water. Going to move back and left. Back and left. Back and left. Survivor's halfway up. Coming left and aft.
Created partially in response to this incident, the Rescue Swimmer program has been hugely successful. It officially began in 1984, only a year after the Marine Electric sank, and partially due to a recommendation from the NTSB in direct response to this incident. From the U.S. Coast Guard Aviation History website, Congress mandated in the Coast Guard Authorization Act of '84 that the Commandant of the Coast Guard shall use such sums as are necessary from amounts appropriated for the operational maintenance of the Coast Guard to establish a helicopter rescue swimmer program for the purpose of training selected Coast Guard personnel in rescue swimming skills. Interestingly, the program was designed to be gender non-specific from its inception. Continued from the Coast Guard's Aviation History website, physical fitness standards and requirements were established. The requirements were mission-specific. Female personnel who possessed the strength and stamina and met the established standards were eligible to become rescue swimmers. In fact, the first female swimmer joined the team only 2 years after the program began, and she stayed with the team for 5 years before attending officer school and eventually becoming a helicopter pilot. From DVIDs, Lieutenant Commander Kelly Larson, the 13th District Command Center Chief, joined the Coast Guard in '84 and became the first female to complete Navy Rescue Swimmer School, May 23, 1986, made even more impressive by the program's intense physical requirements, challenging for anyone to say the least. From supportourtroops.org, quote, "To become a certified rescue swimmer, a candidate must pass the following fitness test: 5 pull-ups, 5 chin-ups, 50 push-ups, 60 sit-ups, 25-yard underwater swims completed 4 times, a buddy tow of 200 yards, and a 500-yard swim in under 12 minutes. This pretty much disqualifies 99% of the U.S. population," unquote. Rescue swimmers must also undergo medical training to maintain as much space for survivors as possible in rescue helicopters. Again, from the Coast Guard's Aviation History website. For a short period of time, hospital corpsmen were part of the flight crew. Due to weight and space limitations on HH-65 Dolphin and HH-60 Jayhawk helos, it was decided that the Coast Guard helicopter rescue swimmers should be qualified to perform these duties, eliminating the need to carry a hospital corpsman in the aircraft. Therefore, in addition to their other training, rescue swimmers are required to attend 3 weeks of training at EMT school at Coast Guard Training Center, Petaluma, California. Since the 1980s, reportedly only about 900 individuals have qualified as U.S. Coast Guard rescue swimmers. But those few individuals have saved thousands of lives, particularly during the fallout from Hurricane Katrina. From militarynews.com. Coast Guard helicopter rescue swimmers have saved or assisted countless lives in the most harrowing of circumstances. In Hurricane Katrina, more than 3,000 lives were saved as the search and rescue operation unfolded on live television. And again from the Coast Guard's Aviation History website. The rescue swimmer program has and continues to be outstandingly successful. During the period 1985 through 2004, Coast Guard helicopter rescue swimmers saved more than 5,700 lives. This elite group operates in the most severe weather conditions imaginable, deploying into extremely hostile environments. The record of success is directly attributable to the training, professionalism, and courage, not only of the rescue swimmers, but also of the air crews who deploy them.
We've had more roles and responsibilities put onto us. We now, outside of water rescues, we'll do inland search and rescue. With hurricanes, we do a lot of urban search and rescue. We're getting training constantly, new ways to deploy, new ways to recover people in varying situations.
That Navy rescue swimmer who volunteered to come in on his day off and managed to pull 3 victims from the Marine Electric into the Coast Guard helos rescue baskets before he was nearly incapacitated due to hypothermia, was formally recognized for his heroic efforts with the Navy and Marine Corps Medal for Heroism.
The President of the United States takes pleasure in presenting the Navy and Marine Corps Medal to Aviation Structural Mechanic Structures 2nd Class James D. McCann II, United States Navy.
As we mentioned earlier, the rescue swimmers weren't the only important safety development inspired by the tragedy of the Marine Electric. Immersion suits, also known as exposure suits, also became required gear for cold water shipping. From the U.S. Coast Guard. Immersion suits are required on commercial vessels operating in cold water, specifically beyond the boundary line north of 32 degrees north latitude and on Lake Superior for documented vessels. All vessels operating in coastal waters on the west coast of the U.S. north of Point Reyes, California, beyond coastal waters in cold water, and on Lake Superior must carry immersion suits. Now, there's several different kinds of immersion suits, but they all have one thing in common. They greatly improve the odds of a person surviving in the water. Due to hypothermia, the unprotected crew members of the Marine Electric only had about 30 minutes of consciousness in the water and roughly an hour to live. Compare that to this information from marineinsight.com. According to SOLAS LSA provisions, the immersion suit should meet the given safety and performance requirements, including no more than 2 minutes of donning time, impact protection of up to 4.5 meters, and hypothermia protection for 6 hours. If the crew of the Marine Electric had been wearing immersion suits, many more of them would likely have been able to survive long enough for their rescuers to arrive, especially since the first helicopters were on scene and pulling people out of the water within an hour and a half. The Alaska Ranger that sank in 2008, which I've done a video on, is a prime example of dozens of crew members surviving for extended periods, floating in the frigid waters of the Bering Sea awaiting rescue. The Coast Guard's rescue swimmer program that night, plus enough immersion suits carried on board the fishing trawler for the entire crew, meant the survival rate of the Alaska Ranger was flipped compared to that of the Marine Electric, with 42 of the 47 crew surviving for hours in frigid waters, stormy seas, and pure chaos as their ship went down. Despite the chaos when the ship sank, the one crucial step those crew members all stopped and organized around was ensuring they all donned immersion suits. Regarding the tragedy of the Marine Electric, perhaps its most immediate impact at the time was shining light on the need for T2 tankers to finally be retired on a large scale. From Robert Frump, quote, "An old ship squadron of seasoned, serious inspectors was formed and activated. One by one, the old ships were cited finally for the true violations of safety codes contained in their old hulls and hatches. So many violations were cited that the companies had no choice but to send them to the scrapyard. The inspectors finally were sending them to the dump. The accommodation of irresponsible one-more-trip owners was over. More than 70 very old vessels were scrapped or laid up in the 2 years after the wreck of the Marine Electric. The impact of inspections on the merchant marine fleet of the United States seems unparalleled. More than half of the large bulk carriers of the American merchant fleet were junked virtually overnight. Even more followed in subsequent years. The losses to owners were estimated at more than $1 billion. The majority of those dangerous ancient vessels were scrapped, but a handful of T2s remained in service well into the 2000s. The final one destroyed only a little over 10 years ago. From the National Park Service, quote, "The last T2 is gone, but it was only scrapped in 2013 after some 70 years of service. This was the SS Mission San Fernando. She was launched November 1943 and served in her original role until 1957, when she was extended by 80 feet, renamed Muscle Shoals, and then in 1958, USNS Vanguard. She participated in the Apollo project, and then the joint US-Soviet Apollo-Soyuz test project, and Skylab missions. Her final role was as a navigational test ship, in which she aided submarines testing their navigation equipment. She finally retired in 1999 and remained mothballed until March 2005, when it was proposed that she be turned into a museum ship. In the end, she would not be saved and was scrapped in November 2013, being the last of the T2 class tankers. The loss of this final T2 marked the end of an era when tankers hastily created to serve in World War II instead remained active for decades past their primes, like an industrial version of those Army DUKWs, or Army Ducks, put to use in the tourism industry. The widespread use of these ships led to crew members routinely risking their lives, with very few safer alternatives. Today, according to DiveBuddy.com, the remains of the Marine Electric supposedly lie in 121 to 130 feet of water off the coast of Maryland and Virginia, not far from where it originally sank. It can be visited by diving enthusiasts and is reportedly a, quote, great dive, although reportedly not recommended for beginners. From the Office of National Marine Sanctuaries, the wreck is in two major pieces in about 125 feet of water, about 30 miles east of Chincoteague Inlet. The wreck is heavily visited by divers, commercial fishermen, and recreational anglers.
When all of a sudden the words came into my mind, rise again, no matter what you've lost, be it a home, a love, a friend, like the Mary Ellen Carter, rise again. And I just kept saying that over, and then the water cleared away, and I'd shout it out and sing it out. And another sea would come down on top of me. And I firmly believe that if it wasn't for that happening to me, I just was in a position where I couldn't have come through. And that song made the difference in me living through that night. There isn't any question in my mind whatsoever about it.
On the campus of the Merchant Marine Academy in Bourne, Massachusetts, there is a Merchant Marine Memorial with 7 plaques, one of which commemorates those lost on the Marine Electric. There is also a Waterman's Memorial on Chincoteague Island that lists those souls lost in the sinking. Despite the beauty and importance of these remembrances, perhaps the most crucial actions that honor their loss are the safety innovations they inspired, like the Coast Guard Rescue Swimmer Program, the required cold water immersion suits, and the forced retirement of those T2 tankers that once served their country well yet made into death traps in the pursuit of profit. What those mariners endured led to the safety and rescue of thousands of others. So here we are 6 months later. I realized the wait for this one was much longer than usual, so I truly appreciate your patience and all the support in the meantime. I'm always striving for us to keep improving the quality of our productions, even by just a little bit each time. Not necessarily looking for perfection, of course, but with the bar so high, it means a 3-hour video took much longer than even I predicted. This one was also so graphics and research intensive that I dedicated myself to it full time since January. Oftentimes we can work on more than one video at once, but myself and the team had to set everything else aside for the sake of Marine Electric. Back when I created Marine Electric's project folder in August of 2022, just perusing the incident, taking it all in, the effects it had on the industry and so on, I knew immediately Marine Electric was going to deserve this sort of treatment, or it simply wasn't going to get made. Ashley, the team's primary researcher and writer, was a major catalyst in making me feel that Marine Electric was finally a possibility. And yes, that project folder I mentioned, having been made in August of 22, is like so many others on my workstation desktop. There's a Brick Immortar project folder for just about every major maritime incident you can think of. It's typically not a matter of how much it's requested, how popular I think it'll be, although these do factor in somewhat. The initial choice to even make it a candidate for future production is whether it's something I feel we can create in the way the incident and lessons learned deserve. I often hear it summed up in the phrase, safety regulations are written in blood. Which of course is true, but to me, and you can tell by the length of this video probably, I personally can't stand minimizing what these folks went through down to some cliche phrase without giving it the weight of what they actually went through, and almost always unwillingly. I'm glad the saying can quickly get the attention of those who may not be aware in the first place, aware of just how and why systemic safety is so important. But we can regularly see it play out right in front of us, just what happens when the passage of time slowly erodes our memory of those crucial lessons their losses taught us, or worse, when we outright forsake it. We can boil it down to a catchy phrase all we want, but the day-to-day of putting those lessons into practice, say, on the road in your vehicle in a hurry because you're running late, at the workplace when you're sick at the shop floor and just counting the minutes till your shift ends, after so many hours on the water and everyone aboard is grumpy. We are all on the same boat. No amount of signs, laws, labels, or safety posters will make a difference without the compassion for and cooperation with those around us. So anyway, this channel just wouldn't be possible without the support of so many who believe in our mission. And a special thanks goes out to those top-tier supporters on Patreon. Aaron M., Alex N., Alex S., Alex W., Andrew F., Andrew M., Anna B., Anthony B., Bonesauce7590, Brendan C., Broken Spectrum, Captain Ron S., Caroline, Chadillac, Christian T., Colin D., Dagger F., David M., Drew That One Stady R., Elijah C., Green Sea Ships, Hayden Taylor, Hunter B., Jack C., Jenica S., Jensen Bond, Joshua S., Justin S., Kyle W., Library of Scars, Lisa J., Manuel M., Mark W., Matt W., Maxim K., Maximum Hats, Meg T., Michael M., Nicholas E., Owen W., Paul Rohrbaugh, P. Rush, Paul Z., Keith Payton, Philip A. L., Philippa M., Rats and Lab Coats, Robert G., Someone on Earth 598, Space Cadet and Operative Gamma, The Handkerchief, and Vlad B. And don't forget, your safety matters.